Good morning, everyone online, everyone in the room. It's great to see you all back here this morning for day 2 and the final day indeed, of this ActEU workshop on the revision of ICH E6 GCP. Great to see you all back. We've a very nice agenda today. I'm taking it a little bit easy this morning. I'll be handing over to my colleague, Kim Peach, to give some opening remarks. Kim is a seconded national expert from the Paul Ehrlich Institute. We've a system here in European institutions where those from the member states, from the regulators in the member states and health authorities and even health facilities can be seconded to the EMA to give some knowledge to us, and indeed we impart some knowledge on them and they go back to the network. And Kim was assisting me in the E6 revision and very dedicated. I believe, Kim, you joined from your honeymoon at one stage. Yes. So that's how dedicated he is. But Kim, I'll hand over to you for the opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for the kind introduction. And also, I would like to welcome everyone joining us either here on site or online. And I'll just have few remarks, especially for those who were not able to join us yesterday. So a recording of the full workshop will be made available on EMA's website in due time after the workshop, along with a meeting report, which will cover key messages from the presentations and also the discussions we are having or had yesterday and going to have today, as we do have exciting topics with distinguished speakers as well for you. And I think the last remark I'll have for you, so even if you only were able to follow part of the workshop, so we love and welcome your feedback. So we showed yesterday and we're going to show at the end of today the code for the post-workshop survey, because also here on the EMA, we are working here giving a platform so the expert stakeholders can come together, and then in order to address your needs, it's always good to get feedback from you as well. And with this, I'm handing back to you, Peter.
Sure, thank you very much, Kim. We know a lot of questions have been coming in via the Slido. I don't know the exact number, it's certainly in excess of 100. And what we've tried to do in relation to answering questions, many of them will have been addressed via the presentations. We are trying to group questions and address them in a broader manner. And as Kim alluded to as well, there'll be a summary record after this meeting with some of the key concepts included there. So we are doing our best to address as many questions as we can. We appreciate people might be a bit disappointed if their exact question is not read out, but just please bear with us. There's quite a bit that we have to get through. For the rest of today then, we are starting off with session 1, and this is to do with sponsor oversight and the main changes. And then we'll move on and we will move over to main changes in essential. I'm definitely skipping over data governance somewhere here. Data governance is after that, and we can't skip over that. It's a brand new section. So the sponsor oversight will be provided by Rebecca Stambrook, our FPA representative at the EWG. Data governance by Lisbeth Reinhodge from the DKMA, who's the expert there, and really did Trojan work in drafting that section. And then we'll move on after that to our panel discussion. After coffee break then, we are going to have the main changes in the areas of essential records. Now, we know essential records caused a level of confusion, considerable level actually, from the public comments, and there was some further amendments there. So I think this will be a really valuable session. And indeed then we'll finish off, and Suzanne Norskov from the FPA will be leading that, and we'll finish off with safety management then from Gabriella Schwartz, before moving on to the panel discussion. And then we'll be wrapping up at the end of the day. We're due to finish today at 2:00, and really we hope then it will have been a fruitful session. I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, without further ado then, I'd like to start session 1. And Rebecca Stambrook will be our first speaker, and I understand for the panel session then Spiros van Vakas, the previous regulatory chair for E6, will be joining us. But without further ado, Rebecca, let's hand over to you first, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Peter, and thanks again to EMA for inviting FPA to support this very interesting and hopefully for you informative event. So I'm going to talk about sponsor main changes. Next slide, please. And as usual, we have our usual disclaimer. So these are my thoughts. You don't attribute them to Novartis or FPA, etc. So what are we going to talk about? So we'll go over sort of the main changes and sort of the implications of those changes. And then we'll specifically go on over some changes from the draft to the final. And I'll try and sort of pick out some of the reasons as to why we made those changes. And of course, I always like to give a bit of a take-home message. So what do you need to sort of think about as a sponsor? And the clue is in the word there, think. Next slide, please. So what are the main changes for the sponsor? And for this, I'm going to be using the Step 4 slide deck. One of the things I like to try and do whenever presenting is try and bring that slide deck to life. So what was the sort of thinking behind what we wrote in that presentation? Because obviously that supplements what's in the guideline, tries to sort of bring the guideline to life. But now we're trying to bring the Step 4 presentation to life. Next slide, please. So handily, at the beginning of each section of the Step 4 slide deck, and of course the Step 2 slide deck as well, so you'll notice this for the Annex 2 revision as well, we try and give you a bit of a pointer because everybody knows R2 like the back of their hand, so they'd be able to sort of tell you, where the investigator section about informed consent was and where the sponsor section about the oversight from a sort of monitoring perspective was. But we wanted to sort of try and give a bit of a help to you to sort of try and point out where they were in the new R3. And so what you'll notice here is that there are two sections that weren't in R2. And two sections which, well, I personally think a bit strange that they weren't included. So resources, we talk about having sufficient resources at the investigator site, but surely the sponsor also needs to have sufficient resources to be able to conduct and oversee the trial appropriately. And sponsor oversight, can you believe it? That word, that term wasn't there before. But how many times have we talked about sponsor oversight in the past? Next slide, please. And because it's such a big section, you'll see it on 2 slides. And what you'll notice is there's also some reordering. So we tried to sort of make it more in kind of like an order of a clinical trial. So sort of from design right through to reporting. So that was kind of the thought process for the reordering. We didn't just sort of throw everything up in the air and say, oh, where should we put all these then? Next slide, please. So the part that you're really interested in. So what were the sort of the main things that we really were thinking about when we updated to R3? So trial design. So we really wanted to sort of make sure that there was that thinking element. And so we even actually put it in there about sort of making sure you'd got sufficient safety and efficacy data from your non-clinical studies and your clinical trials and other data sources, so perhaps real world data, to be able to support what you were intending to do in this particular clinical trial. And then, of course, we were thinking about the GCP renovation as a whole. And when you think about that, you obviously can't think about that without thinking about E8, general considerations for clinical studies, because that embeds the thought about quality by design. And obviously we wanted to sort of put that thread into the clinical trial area, thinking about sort of building quality into the trial. So really think about, as you're developing your protocol, right, what is my research question? So first of all, you need a very clear research question. What is it I want to answer? What data do I need to be able to answer that research question appropriately? And really, please do focus on that important data. And I'll come back to why that is important later on. And of course, when you're developing the protocol, think about critical to quality factors. So what are those factors that if you didn't get them right, you would have potential participant safety concerns, issues with the data, reliability of the trial results. So what are those things that you really need to sort of try and focus on and then try and mitigate them? So it might even be that as you're writing the protocol, you think, well, actually, there's something I can perhaps do with ensuring that this database is only accessed by one particular set of people and make that very clear in the protocol. So maybe you want to try and sort of build that into the protocol. Because what I've seen in the past is sometimes we've had protocols as an inspector where I've seen the protocol's been amended before even the first patient set foot through the trial site door. So, really build a good protocol. And so that patient engagement is really important. And you heard from Sally and Hilda yesterday about the cabs, so certainly encourage that. So really think about writing a good protocol that you're trying to mitigate any risks. And as I said, consider input from interested parties. And you'll notice there we changed from interested parties, from stakeholders, because it was seen as perhaps a term that was a better fit, interested parties. And so, make sure you've got that input. And we're not talking about it on a trial by trial level. So we're more talking about it on a development level, as you see coming from E8. But really, you want to make sure that if you've got sort of input, is it feasible to be having an ECG and then 2 minutes later having an MRI scan? The investigator would clearly tell you, well, actually, they're at different ends of the hospital. How are we going to be able to sort of do this in this time frame? And of course, then your patient advocacy groups and your patients will tell you, well, this is the level of risks that I'm willing to accept. This is the number of biopsies that would be appropriate for this particular type of length of trial. So, seek those inputs because it will help you build a protocol which will be more feasible from an operational perspective and actually more sort of perhaps less burdensome for for the participants and the investigators. And then, of course, we also talk about other documents, not just the protocol. So you've written your protocol, great, but your stats analysis plan doesn't sort of mirror what you're trying to do in the protocol from a statistical perspective. So make sure all of those documents are aligned with the protocol. And I think there's quite a lot of work going on in various organisations to try and sort of pull that data through from sort of right from the protocol through all of the data management, statistical analysis, right through to the clinical trial report. So make sure that they are, fit for purpose. Also make sure they're concise. Protocols are getting very, very long these days. And, we want to sort of make sure that they're clear to answer the research question and collect the appropriate data. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to avoid this unnecessary burden on participants and investigators. We also talked about agreements in there. So we said, and it seems very, very obvious, doesn't it? Make sure you've got your agreement in place before you get them doing some work for you. Sounds very obvious, but, I can tell you a lot of people didn't have sometimes these agreements in place, because they were rushing to get that first patient, first visit in. So I would always say, top tip, think about your database lock. That is going to be the important key date. It's all very well sort of getting the first patient through the door if you're then amending the protocol because it isn't quite fit for purpose. So spend a little bit more time in planning because I think you'll find that then your database lock and your clinical trial report will come a little bit quicker than if you were just focusing on first patient, first visit. And we also sort of tried to sort of clarify, you need to update your agreements. So it's all right putting an agreement in place, but then you're asking somebody to do something slightly differently. So do make sure you update that agreement. And one of the other things that we were trying to do here was this responsibilities, this blurring of the line between the investigator and the sponsor, as we were talking about yesterday, and perhaps in terms of home nurses. So we were trying to sort of make that a little bit clearer as well. Next slide, please. So that term sponsor oversight, we've actually now got that in the document, in the guideline. So we're really saying, do what's right for your participant population, for their right safety and well-being, and what's right for the trial results. So, make sure that you're thinking about what the critical to quality factors are and the risks to those factors and focus your attention on what matters. Does it matter if a blood draw is at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock? Well, for some trials, possibly not. PK, yes, it would matter. But think about it. What matters? So when I talk about the protocol, have a look at the protocol section, because there's a nice preamble introduction to that protocol section in Appendix B, which says these are the elements that are generally included in a clinical trial protocol. So hence the general. So you'll see that we're actually very in line with M11. So another guideline to do take a look at, which is the electronic protocol template. And I believe there's a lot of information on the website already, the ICH website. So make sure that you write a good protocol. That's the key aspect that I want you to take away with. So also we clarified what we meant in terms of quality assurance and quality control, and that also came into the protocol section as well. And we also talked about oversight of other facilities. So not just the investigator site, but, sometimes we contract central imaging readers. We might sort of have done some due diligence to make sure that they're appropriate for what we want them to handle within the trial. But, then we just let them get on with it. But actually, make sure you've got good oversight. Are they sending the data to you, to the investigator, when you're expecting them to? Because we want to make sure that the investigator is well informed so that they can make the medical decisions for their trial participants. Quality management, you'll see some changes there. Once again, we tried to clarify again the assessment and management of critical to quality factors. And you'll see that mirrored in some of the training materials, which are going to be coming out hopefully towards the middle of the summer. So watch out for those. They'll be providing some additional information for you. And of course, we encourage proportionality and clarified acceptable ranges. So that's also in that protocol section, Appendix B, as I mentioned before, because we're trying to sort of make sure that you've got appropriate protocol deviations, ones that are meaningful. So does it matter when something is drawn? And you might want to be thinking about that as you perhaps use more real life data elements that come from general clinical practice. Next slide, please. And monitoring. There were some quite substantial changes in monitoring, and I thank the drafting team for that. I know Suzanne and Gabriella and Elizabeth were very heavily involved in the drafting of this section. And what we were trying to do here was say, look, monitoring is actually a QC activity. So, make sure your monitors are appropriately trained to be able to what you're expecting them to do. So we're often sort of expecting an inexperienced person to go and speak to an investigator who's got realms of experience, so make sure that they've got the appropriate information to be able to sort of speak about what the expectations of that trial are. We also talked about centralised monitoring. So we talk about source data review, source data verification, and the fact that source data review, it's going to be done by different people other than your monitors because they're sat in the sponsor site or perhaps a service provider looking at the data, looking for trends. Are there rounding issues? Are you seeing that actually in this trial, isn't it funny? People come in one after another. So I know we had a trial where the participants were very, very well trained. They had to dial into the IRT system. And blow me, one of them dialed in at 8 o'clock. And then participant number 2 dialed in at 8:05. Participant number 3, well, it was 8:11. Oh, they were a minute late. So, you start then to think, well, hang on a minute. These people are all over the place, all different areas within this particular shire. How come they're sort of dialing in one after another? So, those sorts of things you can find out from centralised monitoring. So make sure you set something up to be able to find out issues like that. And then, of course, we talked about the monitoring plan. So we really sort of heavily talked about the monitoring strategy. Do what's right for your participant population and the data that you're generating from those participants. Focus on those really important data points, those critical to quality factors. And then investigational product. Of course, we can't talk about the sponsor section without talking about investigational product, can we? And we also wanted to bring in proportionality. So you'll see proportionality throughout the guideline. So even where you don't see it specifically referenced, think about it. That should be your mantra. How can I do this in a proportionate manner? So what we said was, for investigational product where you've got a marketing authorization, so it was already on the market, there might be some alternative approaches. So do you need an investigator brochure? Well, possibly not. You could perhaps use a basic product information, so we would call it the summary of product characteristics. And also there could be some different approaches to investigational product accountability. So you'll see this also mirrored in Annex 2, where we talk about the sponsor perhaps being able to support the investigator site in their drug accountability. But of course, always in keeping with local regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. And I know we're going to talk about data governance later on, but we do want to talk about it a little bit in the sponsor section, because there are very sponsor-specific systems that were not included in the data governance piece because they were sponsor-specific. So I won't sort of steal Elizabeth's thunder with the data governance, but just wanted to point out that there were some specific things that we wanted to make sure were included in the sponsor section, which were very specific. For instance, randomization of blinding. Who does that? Well, it's the sponsor, obviously. So what we wanted to say here was, protect the blinding. Think about what you need to protect the blinding. So when I used to work in clinical trial supplies, they would only call on me to label product if they were really, really desperate and up against the clock, because they knew that I wasn't always the best person for sticking labels on straight. So one of my things that I used to do when I used to go and inspect or audit was I'd get all the bottles out and sort of line them up. So could you see difference in height in the labels? And, sometimes I've been able to pick out which were the placebo and which were the active because of that. So, really think about that. It seems very simple. Oh, we're just sticking some labels on. But actually, it's actually crucial where you put those labels. We also sort of talked about when unblinding could occur. So we don't want the investigator to have to ring the sponsor to say, oh, is it all right to unblind this patient? They're actually really in a critical condition. Got to do what's right for the participant. The participant is the most important thing here. So, think about that. Sometimes unblinding does occur inadvertently. So what do you do about that? Also, we talked about being fit for purpose. So, computer systems need to be fit for purpose and risk-based. So what is it you're going to be using that computerized system for? Does it need to have a full validation, or is there something that you've got some other form of audit trail behind the data that you don't need to have specific validation for? So really think about it, this translates when you go to the investigator site and you're looking at their electronic health records. And there are some good tools that are available to be able to help you make that assessment. We also then talked about data management processes. So right from sort of the data that you're thinking about wanting to be generated to answer the research question, right to how you then finalize those data sets. So we thought about the full data life cycle. We even thought about saying, well, actually, why don't we have a data flow in there? Didn't do it, but might be something that you want to think about. We certainly did it in Novartis, and I've got a very, very nice slide, which looks like a plate of spaghetti, but very organized spaghetti. So we know exactly where all the data is coming from and going to. So something you might want to think about. And then statistics wasn't sort of really something that was well covered. There was sort of a nod to statistics in the past. And we don't want to steal any thunder from E9 and E9R1 about statistical programming, but we wanted to make sure that there was some thought given about the finalization of data sets and making sure that you actually have a final data set before you then send it for statistical analysis, particularly important, obviously, when you've got a blinded trial. And I always used to say to people, I expect somebody to be signing in blood if they're unlocking a database. There's got to be a really, really good reason. Next slide, please. So I know this is something that people were really sort of keen to understand. And certainly for us, with our gap analysis, it was something important for us. And that's why we actually started the gap analysis with the draft, but then we overlaid the changes from the final so that we could say, well, actually, yes, we're still covered with those SOPs. But this might help you with some of the changes. Next slide, please. So we really wanted to sort of hammer home the point about this unnecessary burden for participants and investigators. We want to try and do more with less. Can we sort of run a trial and answer so many questions at once? But we're then asking the investigator to rub their stomach, tap their head, see the patient over here, take some blood here, write the SAE up here, and we're trying to get them to do too much. So sometimes think about what is the real research question you want to answer, and then focus on the important facts. Do you need all those tertiary endpoints? Do you need all those exploratory endpoints? Think about what's important. We also clarified the point about sort of the record retention. So it's in line with local regulatory requirements. And there was a piece there you'll see about sort of service providers needing to have appropriate quality management systems. So what we've said is, and I think this is in Annex 2, is where you've got a service provider that perhaps isn't sort of your regular CRO, they might already have an excellent quality management system which would meet the principles of GCP anyway. So you need to make that assessment that they're appropriate with their own quality management system that they have. The other thing we included here was, please do report incidents that might have impact for the participants or the trial results to the sponsor. So I know EMA can probably talk about several examples where it's been the sponsor that's been reporting something, and then you've had reports from 20 sponsors, but the service provider's been quite silent on the matter. And then I believe EMA are then sort of just asking a few words of the service provider as to what happened. Then we talked about important protocol deviations. So we had a very, very long discussion about deviations from the protocol. What is an important deviation? People get very, very tidy knots about protocol deviations. So if you look at clinical trial reports and you see the tables, figures and listings with the protocol deviations, huge number. So once again, I'm pointing you back to the protocol section. Have a look at those acceptable ranges. What is not going to cause any detriment to the participant safety or the reliability of trial results if you collect something at a different time. Then we also clarified a bit about what information goes to the adjudication and assessment committees that you might have. We see more and more of those these days. How do you provide data to them? You want to make sure that you're not introducing bias into their thought processes. So we sort of included some information there about that. Next slide, please. And we've already talked about this one. We really tried to ensure that you were thinking about critical to quality factors as you were developing the protocol, and then not just going, oh, great, I've done that, tick that box, but think about how they progress as you go through the trial conduct, and incorporate those risk mitigation activities into not just the protocol, but your monitoring strategies, and even your agreements with parties, because it could be the party that could be picking up that risk to the critical to quality factor. Now, this one was an interesting one because, some people are not clear the difference between remote monitoring and centralized monitoring. So remote monitoring, it's still source data verification. So you've got access to the electronic health records, and we always want to have access where it's specific to those particular patients in the trial. So, make sure that you can't see everything. And we always, there was some nice work done by BfArM and Pi with regards to things to think about when you're remote monitoring during the pandemic. You don't go and do it in the local coffee house when you're in the middle of the coffee place where everybody can see what you're looking at. So then central monitoring, just to finish the story off, it's where you're looking at the data, but you don't know who the data is from. So you're looking for those trends that I talked about. Also, we talked about control of unblinding in an interim analysis. So, how do you make sure that you've got a separate set of people who are looking at the data and you're not biasing the people that remain blinded? We talked yesterday about data points. So the next two about sort of timely access to information and make sure that you've got the appropriate data points so that the investigator can make an informed medical decision about their particular participant. And we also then reiterated the piece about exclusive control. So, and also about detecting undetectable changes. So who's making the change? Why have they made the change? And make sure that the data is under the control of the investigator. Next slide, please. So what's the overall goal? So for me, next slide, please. It's about thinking, do what's right for the participant safety, rights and well-being, and for the reliability of the trial results. And throughout, think about proportionate approach. What makes sense in the terms of the design for answering the research question? Get appropriate engagement from your patients, your advocacy groups, your CABs, your healthcare professionals, so that you're making sure that you've got a trial that's fit for purpose. And I can't say enough about writing a good protocol, and make it that it's easy to understand, maybe some more diagrams in there so that it makes it easier for the investigator to understand, and make sure that it's feasible. Think about those critical to quality factors and don't just think about them once throughout the course of your clinical trial. Think about responsibilities. So during the trial conduct, make sure it's very clear who's doing what, who's responsible for what, and that you've got appropriate agreements in place. Where you've got investigational product, think about has it got a marketing authorization already? Are there any adaptations I can make for that? Then we come on to analysis. Is the data of appropriate quality? What do I need to do in terms of cleaning of that data before I lock the database and then send it on to the statistical analysis people? Another good favourite of mine was I always used to look at the stats analysis plan. What did you plan to do when you first wrote the trial protocol? And then what have you actually done? Have you been sort of thinking, oh, do you know what? Wouldn't it be great if we did that with the stats analysis? So, make sure that the stats analysis plan mirrors what you actually end up doing. Then you saw we've included pieces about the transparency of trial results. So making those results available, layperson summaries, you see on the websites of the agencies about sort of the trial results, and you've got sort of a place to be able to put that. Also consider making the results available to participants if they should wish it. Making sure the clinical trial report is appropriately written in a timely manner. We've got legislative timelines of a year and 6 months for paediatric trials. And then, of course, we'll hear later about the archiving of essential records. And the usual plea from me, please, an essential record repository is not an archive. It's a good place to help with your sponsor oversight during the course of your trial. And as I mentioned, it's about proportionality throughout. So think about what makes sense for your participants and what makes sense for the clinical trial results reliability. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a fantastic presentation. Many practical examples, really nice overview. Brilliant. Good job. one part I don't believe was when you were giving the example of the placebo that you used to put labels on crookedly as a pharmacist. I don't believe that. But apart from that, I think really good, really great job, and thank you. But now we have another session, fantastic session. We have data governance coming up with Lisbeth from the DKMA, and this is a brand new section based on lots of standard principles and practices, and all looking forward to this. So Lisbeth, over to you, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I'm sure everybody can relate to how important data are. So it's on the agenda everywhere. It's on the agenda in the EU, globally. You know, how can we make best use of the data? How can we trust the data? For instance, with AI, how can we make smart use of the data? And also from the beginning of drafting this guideline or revising it, it was quite clear that we needed to have data on the agenda. And that was for several reasons. The R2 was a little bit outdated in some areas. So first of all, it didn't take account of new data types, new system types. It had some outdated definitions. So for instance, a very heavy focus on electronic CRFs, whereas we know nowadays, I saw some numbers recently saying that around 70% of the data in a clinical trial are now from external sources, so outside the eCRF, so that needed to be reflected as well. And also, R2 is very much stated that computerized systems are sponsor responsibility, but in modern days, IT systems are also investigator responsibility. They have loads of electronic systems. So we needed to reflect that as well and have a good discussion about who has the responsibility for that. So, in addition to that, we made a kind of gap analysis initially, also kind of discovering that E9 is pointing to E6 for operational guidance, and we haven't really given much of that in R2. So a subgroup was made and drafted some initial work, went back to the EWG, and also I would say to the academic stakeholders, because they were really important in this and giving their inputs to how do we strike the right level of proportionality in terms of, for instance, responsibility for computerized systems. And if you go to the next slide, it's just my disclaimer. So you can see that this presentation will be a mixture of the official EWG slides, which you can find on the internet, and then some slides that I've drafted for this and other purposes. So if you look at the revised structure, I pointed out some of the things we're going to look at when we talk about data governance, because really key to understanding the data governance parts of this guideline is to understand how to read the guideline. So we have, I'll touch on Principle 9 in a few minutes. And then from Annex 1, we have, as Peter told you about, the new data governance section. So I'm going to start a little bit from behind the glossary terms and then the data governance session, which are the general requirements to data and computerized systems for the responsible parties. And in this context, the responsible parties are the sponsor and the investigator. So Section 4 should kind of be read together with Section 212 for investigator responsibility over records and reports, and 316.1 and 316.2 for sponsor responsibility. So it's really important that you hold these pieces together. And Susanne yesterday told about updates on the investigator, also for records and reports, and Rebecca has just addressed some of the changes in the sponsor section. So those should be read together with Section 4. So next slide, please. Yeah, so you can see here I pointed to Principle 9, and it's reflecting a little bit the old 210 principle. And if you go to the next slide, already the drafting of the principles is kind of showing you where we want to go with this guideline, because where 210 talked about all clinical trial information should then Principle 9 really talks about that the quality and amount should be sufficient to support good decision making. So being sufficient is completely different from having full control of all clinical trial data and making sure that all the clinical trial data fulfill the same criteria. So here, the proportionality has been built in also in the systems and processes and the computerized systems. So it's really focusing on those being fit for purpose to capture the data required by the protocol, and being implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risk to participants and the acquired data. Also in 9.4, clinical trials should incorporate efficient and robust processes for managing the records. And you will recognize here the remainder of 2.10, so allowing for the accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification of the relevant clinical trial-related information. So these are selected parts. I'm not going to go through the whole principle. That should probably be familiar to you. So if we go to the next slide, please. We're now coming to some selected glossary terms. So we have some new glossary terms for data integrity and also for the data acquisition tools. So data integrity is really now pointing to some of the attributes of the data. So you will recognize when you look at it, the Alcoa plus principles, and also adding the word secure. So you really need to also keep the data secure to have data integrity. Data acquisition tool is really now the overarching word for collecting data. So you will have a data originator, which can be a human, it could be a participant, it could be an investigator, so human, it could also be from a machine. And it can also, we touched a little bit about yesterday, can be actually pulling data, for instance, from a medical record into an ECRF or into a database, and that kind of integration of systems. Metadata is a new glossary term as well. We introduced that because there was a very much focus in R2 on audit trail. And audit trail is one we revised as well to let people know that this is one kind of metadata, but it's not the only metadata that is important when you look at electronic systems. For instance, you could also have like alarms, event logs, user logs, and things like that are needed to kind of understand the complete handling of the data. Next slide, please. Yeah, so moving a little bit into data governance. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if we look at the step 4 presentation, it talks about that we introduced this new section to provide guidance to the responsible parties. And as I already said, the responsible parties here are the investigator and the sponsor on the approach management of data integrity. We defined some of the key processes that are important. So things like data protection, managing the computerized systems, and really also pointing to what are some of the essential elements such as randomization, dose adjusting, blinding, and processes that need to be in place to support key decision making. And Rebecca mentioned some of them, so data finalization, unblinding, and also a thing like DMC, data monitoring committee activities are really important as well. And it was specified that processes should focus on the criticality and be implemented proportionately and documented appropriately as well. We've described the full data lifecycle elements, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So from data capture to data destruction, and we clarified the meaning of metadata. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here you really see the full data lifecycle as we envisioned it. So starting, and you can see here that you really have mixed responsibilities. So some of these are are more investigator tasks, and some of them are more sponsor tasks, but some of them are also kind of shared responsibility. And starting by data capture, then going on to defining the relevant metadata, including the audit trail. And I would like to dwell a little bit on the two boxes here about defining the relevant metadata and review of data and metadata, because that is something that's been brought up during public consultation. So it's the cause of some confusion, and I've already had a lot of good talks with data managers about what are the expectations for audit trail or metadata review, and that is something for another day to dwell into. But just to say that the expectation is that the responsible party is really, they know their system, so they know which data are important and of higher criticality. So we do not expect a complete review of all metadata, because that would simply just not be feasible. But we would expect that you could point to your system and say, okay, it's important to know who entered these data where, and how they are processed, and that you can only be certain of by reviewing these data and metadata. Then there are procedures for data corrections, and I'll come back to those in the sponsor responsibility section. Another important part is now data transfer, data exchange, and data migration. As you know, in the clinical trial regulation, there's now also a requirement to keep 25 years of retention time. So that will also mean that you need to do sometimes some data migration to make sure that they stay relevant and available. Finalization of data sets prior to analysis, so primarily a sponsor task, but also the investigator will kind of be involved in the cleaning, the query, etc. Retention and access and destruction are the last processes here. So next slide, please. So we clarified that computerized systems should be fit for purpose, and the wording "fit for purpose" is very deliberate. And I'll come back to a little bit about the responsibility of the computerized system, and also to the proportionality that we expect to have there. And again, of course, it's proportionality related to the importance to participant safety and the reliability of trial results. The responsibilities should be clear. We had a good example yesterday exactly about the extraction of electronic health record data to an eCRF, and there it's maybe a little bit in between sponsor and investigator responsibility, depending on who is it something the institution just they have a module where the sponsors can pick from structured fields, or are we more talking about I don't know, an AI algorithm and looking at some natural language processing, things like that. So depending on who sets it up, and it will be a cooperation between the parties, then that responsibility really needs to be clear. Whereas in other areas, it's more easy to say who has the responsibility. And also we described the elements of computerized systems life cycle to be addressed from design of the system to decommissioning. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just an overview of the new section 4. So you'll recognize what I just, the first parts that I just said. And just to say that section 4.3 is really about some subsets of the computerized systems. I'm not going to go into detail about that in the interest of time today. And also because it's not that different from the European e-guideline, which came out now almost a couple of years ago. So we would expect that people are quite familiar with those. Next slide, please. So this one I think is really important, and I have to say this is kind of my private visual aid to facilitate the understanding of reading the guideline. So who has the responsibility of which systems? And I try to kind of put it into a responsibility matrix, and throughout the guideline, when you read section 212 and 316, you will see that wordings is used such as systems deployed by the investigator, systems deployed by the sponsor, and those are the ones you have at the top. And then you have on the left side the systems designed for clinical trial purposes, and the system used for clinical trials but designed for other purposes. And then in the yellow here, I have examples of the different systems. So if you take the upper left, you would have the systems that are deployed by the investigator or institution specifically for clinical trial purposes. So that could be things like an investigator SILE file electronically, or an AI algorithm designed to screen patients in a health record or to measure trial endpoints. So very specific for clinical trials. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have the systems deployed by the sponsor. So that could be bespoke systems, so sponsor built CRFs, ePros, IRT systems, and systems designed to be configured or managed, and also at the bottom, things that might even be designed for other purposes. So you can use a wearable or sensor, something, an off-the-shelf product, and keep this kind of responsibility matrix in mind as we go through the investigator and sponsor responsibility here. And then also in this, keep also in mind the proportionality. So here's, because the general thing is that you are inherently in a bigger risk if you use systems outside what they were built for. So if you stick to what it was built for, use it in that context, and maybe for some routine care activities, then it may actually be sufficient to just stick to the validation certificate or something like that. Whereas for bespoke systems, for clinical trials, you need to have a more in-depth validation effort. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if I should quickly summarize the responsibility for computerized system, the sponsor is really responsible for ensuring that for computerized systems which they put in place, so deployed by the sponsor, that the expectation for computerized systems in Section 4 are addressed in a risk proportionate manner. And then the sponsor should also review whether the systems that are used by the investigator institution, so for instance, electronic health records or other recording systems, are fit for purpose in the context of the trial. And they also actually have responsibility for reviewing that investigator site files or algorithms or something used by the investigator sites are fit for purpose. But there's a very big difference between being fit for purpose and having to do full validation effort. So it's really about balancing what is sufficient in the individual situation. And then again, in the upper left quadrangle of the responsibility matrix here at the end, in the event that the investigator institution deploys systems specifically for the purposes of conducting clinical trial, then the investigator is responsible for the systems fulfilling the requirements in Annex 4. Next slide, please. So if we then move on to Investigator Section 212, and keep that in mind what I just said on the next slide, please. So Suzanne went through a little bit of this yesterday, so I'm not going to spend more time on this slide, but go on to the next slide, please. Then I've selected some sections here from 212 to say what is investigator responsibility. So they have overall responsibility for the data integrity of the data under their responsibility. And then they also have they have to make sure that they get full access to the data. We talked a little bit about it yesterday, that the sponsor should make sure the investigator have access to data, and then the investigator has the possibility and responsibility for overseeing the safety of their participants, and thereby also needing some time to go into some of the external data, central lab reports, obviously, but also sometimes ePro data or others, to review those. And the investigator also has the responsibility in general to make sure that data acquisition tools and other systems deployed by the sponsor are used as specified. Next slide, please. And also, investigator has responsibility for protecting privacy and confidentiality, and also for ensuring that systems deployed by them, that IT security is in place. Next slide. So what I just said, it will be applicable irrespective of the media. So if you have paper records, electronic records, all the same. But here specifically, we have a section talking about when using computerized systems in a clinical trial. And there you can recognize some of the things I said. So for systems deployed by the investigator institution, ensure that appropriate individuals have secure and attributable access. And for systems deployed by the sponsor, make sure that that the investigator tells the sponsor, who needs to have these access permissions, should a change be revoked, and that's of course more important for blinded and unblinded setups. For systems deployed by the investigator institution specifically for the purpose of the clinical trials, full Section 4 should be addressed proportionately. And then the investigator also have responsibility to make sure that there's a traceability. If there's an ePro given to participant number 1, we need to make sure that device number 2 was given to participant 1 to kind of have the traceability. And if anything happened, incidences with the computer that impacts the data or the patient safety, it should be reported as applicable. Next slide, please. Yeah, so those are some of the investigator responsibility, and then we move to the sponsor section, which is 316, and 316.1 is about the kind of data management activities, and 316.2 is more about leading up to the statistical analysis and the statistical programming. And next slide. Yeah, so for the sponsor section, I'm not going to go through this in detail because Rebecca already covered this. So if you go to the next slide, I can go more into some of the specific requirements. Yeah, so the sponsor should ensure the overall integrity and confidentiality of the data. And then they should apply, and this is not new, it's already an R2 requirement, so quality control to the relevant stages of data handling and really focus on the data of higher criticality and the relevant metadata. So we are not in the situation where we want all data to be absolutely correct. We are more like, don't introduce bias, to make sure that you control the variety of the data, the variation of the data to be able to make a solid conclusion at the end. The sponsor should pre-specify the data to be collected, and Rebecca already talked about that. It's really useful to have a data flow diagram because it's really very complex setups, and we would usually expect to have some description in the data management plan, unless it's like a really simple protocol where you can just have it explained there. The sponsor should ensure that data acquisition tools are fit for purpose, that they are validated and ready for use prior to their required use in the trial. And they should have documented processes for the full data lifecycle. Next slide, please. And then safeguarding the blinding is obviously very important. And in the case that you have unblinding, you really want to have description of who was unblinded, when, and why. And Rebecca also alluded to maybe having, especially if it's a complex setup with unblinded, blinded staff, you need to have like a blinding plan to explain who can be unblinded, who can be blinded, and what happens if somebody gets unintentionally unblinded. And then the sponsor should provide guidance to investigators or institutions, service providers, and trial participants where relevant on all the expectations for data capture, data changes, data retention, and data disposal. Next slide, please. And then we have a few points here about changing of data queries, etc. So the sponsor should not make changes to data entered by the investigator or trial participant unless it's justified and agreed upon by the investigator and documented. On the other hand, they should allow correction of errors to data. And the reason why we put this in is that we've seen over the years that for some ePro specifically, there's been a tendency that ePro vendors and sponsors have said, but you can never correct ePro data. And we've numerous times found on inspections that we look, for instance, in medical records and finding evidence that, the participant rang the investigators to say, I by error entered the wrong data, and the investigators are trying with the sponsor and ePro vendors to get the data corrected and just gets a no. And then obviously when we come out and see this, we see that we have erroneous data in the data that are reported to us as authorities, and that we need to make our decision based on. And if those are the primary efficacy data, you can imagine that you don't want errors like that. So also a little bit a proportionate approach, and of course it needs to be justified and supported by records around the time of the original entry. So do not also come 6 months after suddenly change important primary data, because that's also not something we expect to see. So the sponsor should really ensure that the investigator has timely access to data. We talked about that, and that includes relevant data from external sources. The sponsor should not have exclusive control of data. That is something that's been also the focus in public consultation, which is a little bit funny because this is not a new concept. It was already in section 8.1 in the existing R2. But I think maybe the fact that it's been moved into the sponsor section has given added focus on this point. And it's really about being able to trust the data and to allow the investigator to have appropriate control over their data. And then O is also something that's generated quite a number of comments during public consultation. So the sponsor should seek investigator endorsement of their reported data at predetermined important milestones. So people are commenting like, how does that fit together with the general approval of CRF pages? That the answer to that is that we do not expect an endless approval of each and every eCRF page, but actually that the sponsor has to determine at what milestone do we really need to have the correct data. So for instance, preparing for analysis, preparing for interim analysis, maybe also for DMC review, things like that. Next slide, please. And then the sponsor should determine the data management steps to be undertaken prior to analysis. So this is typically, cleaning of data, coding of data, making sure that you have appropriate data for the analysis. Could be procedures such as database lock, and when can you unlock, things like that. And those procedures are obviously a little bit different, whether it's the final analysis or the interim analysis. So you have to manage your accesses to the data acquisition tools. And also the sponsor should then implement appropriate measures to protect privacy and confidentiality. Next slide, please. Also, this next has already been touched upon yesterday, so I'm not going to dwell with that too much, except to say that the clinical trial regulation is quite clear that in the EU you cannot withdraw any data, even if the patient withdraws consent, whereas that's not been quite as obvious in other regions. And also IT security is sponsor responsibility, and they have the obligation to report serious breaches to national competent authorities. So for that purpose, they also need to have procedures in place for that reporting and also for collecting the data from relevant stakeholders. Next slide, please. And so we're back to the computerized systems, because all the previous ones were kind of irrespective, again, if you have paper systems or electronic systems. For here, We have then for computerized systems, so for systems deployed by the sponsor, we expect the sponsor to have a record of the important computerized systems, and we'll definitely request that when we go out and inspect. And they should ensure that the requirements for computerized systems, so the ones that are described in Section 4, so for validation, audit trails, user management, backup, disaster recovery, IT security, things like that, that is implemented proportionately. They should maintain records of the individual users, also not really new, also already in R2. What we wanted to emphasize here, that those should also really be in accordance with the delegations that are made by the investigator, and it should be clear to the investigator who has which accesses. And then that there's a process in place for service providers and investigators to inform the sponsors of system defects if there are any. Next slide, please. And then we've added some text compared to the public consultation. The first is the same, so the sponsors should, as I said before, also in summarizing the responsibilities, they should assess whether investigator systems are fit for purpose. And we then included the number 7 here below, that in situations where clinical practice computerized systems are being considered for use, the sponsor needs to assess their fitness for use in the purpose of the trial. And that really needs to be done prior to prior to engaging with the investigator side, to make sure that it's not detrimental to the data if not fulfilled. Next slide, please. Then 3.16.2 is us trying to close the gap to E9, which is about the statistical considerations in clinical trials. So here we say that the sponsor should develop a statistical analysis plan, so unless the protocol is very simple and it could be described there. They should ensure appropriate and documented quality control of statistical programming and data analysis. And just to put it a little bit into context, for a typical clinical trial that is used for marketing authorization application, you will have statistical programming programs for, I would say, between 50 and 1,000 statistical programs. So you really need to be to know what is the level of quality control we need, and those that are supporting the primary analysis are obviously very important, and it will differentiate a lot. Some of them are for the tables, listings, and figures of the clinical study reports, and the things that will ultimately end up at the table of the decision makers. You have to determine what is the level of quality control we need there. The sponsor should ensure the traceability of data transformation and derivation. So if they do something to the data after they were reported to the investigator, it needs to be visible to us and documented. It needs also to be clear which patients are in or out of specified analysis. So the rationale for exclusion of any participants should be clearly described and documented. Next slide, please. Rebecca already talked about the deviations from the planned statistical analysis, which we don't expect as such, but which should be really clearly documented and justified, and also reported in the clinical study report. And then there needs to be, for the statistical programming records, we need to be able to say, okay, we have this output, we have a table of figure listings, we need to be that to be traceable to the code that developed it, the software programs. It should be clear where it came from, and it should be protected against changes and access control as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's, I know it's a lot to take in, but really, if you understand that you have to look at Section 4 together with 2.12 and 3.16, I think that should give you a really good background for being able to read the guideline further. And I hope that you see also all the inbuilt proportionality that we managed to put in there. It's not really a one-size-fit-all. there's a wide variety for just determining fitness for purpose, which can be that you maybe it's just if you use it as specified, it's okay. Whereas on the other shelf, you have things where the systems that are driving the primary efficacy endpoint of important safety parameters, where we need to be really sure about the systems that could require a more in-depth validation, for instance. So some of the main changes here is that we clarify that criticality is really a spectrum. It's not either it's critical data or it's not critical. It's really a degree of criticality. And then also maybe just a quick thank you to all those who commented to the document during public consultation, because it really made it a lot better. And one of the examples of that is the next one, moving parts between 3.16.1 and 3.16.2, because we had data management parts in the data analysis part and vice versa. So it really became much better after the public consultation. We clarified which requirements are valid for which types of systems, and added that the investigator should inform the sponsor when access rights needs to be changed or revoked for an individual at the investigator side. We put further emphasis on proportionality for the use of clinical practice systems. And we also clarified that the sponsor should assess the computerized systems used by an investigator prior to their use in the trial. And we added some factors to be considered. Next slide, please. So also we clarified why the sponsor should not have exclusive control of the data, and we clarified wording related to data management steps prior to statistical analysis, and divided it into interim analysis versus final analysis to make it clearer. We included that sponsors should develop a statistical analysis plan unless the approach to data analysis is sufficiently described in the protocol, which will only rarely be, I would say. We added one exceptional example also of when an audit trail can be modified, because we would actually never expect that to happen. The only example we could come up with was in cases where investigator side had inadvertently put in personal information of a participant in a system and reported it to the sponsor, because in that case, it's not actually enough to just delete it, because it will still sit in the audit trail that information was deleted. So that's the only case we've come up with where this is acceptable. We added wording on a few missing steps in the data lifecycle to make section 4 complete. And we also added that you need a process for periodic review of the validated state and the user management as well. And again, of course, in a proportionate way. Next slide, I believe that's the last one. Yes, so I added just a few links here. So both the guideline itself and the step 4 release slides, and also a link to the EU e-guideline, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with already. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And I really hope this very nice overview and comprehensive presentation has demystified the data governance section somewhat. I think we see it as many principles which have been standard practice for many years, which are now have been brought together and put in the ICH E6 guideline. I think this is a really, really welcome addition. So thank you for such a great overview. I'm sure that video will be paused and replayed many times when we have it online. Now, we're going to move on to the panel session, and I'm joined by Spiros Vanvakas, our previous regulatory chair, who's going to moderate the session for me. Spiros, thank you very much indeed.
Good morning. I followed the excellent presentations by Elizabeth and Rebecca in the broadcast, because some back issues don't allow me to sit for very long. And now I'm here to moderate this session. I believe we have only one new member in the panel, which is Jan Geisler. Jan Geisler is a cancer survival and long-standing patient advocate. He has co-founded a number of patient organizations. I'm not going to list them all here. They are in the agenda. I would like to highlight that he's the founder and CEO of Patvocates, a think tank in patient advocacy and patient involvement. And number two, he's also the founder and managing director of the non-profit European Patient Advocacy Institute. And he has served also as the director of EUPATI, the European Patient Academy on Therapeutic Innovation, which I believe you all know. And we can go to the questions. The first question I'm having here for discussion is that more and more tools, e-tools, are used in clinical trials by participants. What is important from a patient's perspective to be taken into consideration? And maybe we can start with Jan, who is on the phone.
Yeah, sure, super. And thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Super interesting. And of course, the ICH guideline is really, really important for us. I mean, we're discussing a lot about study burden, which often is the reason why we're not using tools. But in general, from the patient perspective, I think there's a lot, if you put yourself into the perspective of participants in studies, there's a lot of value coming out of it if we want to really understand patient reality and measure like symptoms, burden of disease, burden of study, whatever, more frequently, also outside of usual clinic visits. And there are a lot of reasons why we could use wearables and other technologies actually to really gather appropriate data in more shorter time frames and more frequently, because what we very often see in these protocols is that, you know, there's an assessment at baseline, there's one at every 8 weeks or at week 48 and 96, but in the end, it doesn't tell you much about patient reality. It just gives you a flavor of the changes. But from a patient perspective, I think what is super important, we always forget that, and I don't see that in the discussion around that at all, is what's the return on engagement for the patient community for these technologies to be used. Because people need to use these tools, but they often feel like they're feeding a machine, but there is no direct return on knowledge, on the way they're being treated, on also being cared for in a study. And I'd just like to mention one example. The Austrian Myeloma Registry 2019 made a publication about the use of ePro. And what they've done is actually they integrated the ePro system into the hospital system, which actually meant that if somebody was coming at the regular visit in the morning and filled out the Pro questionnaires, the investigator was actually seeing the data and the change in Pro scores immediately, so they could actually talk about changes in some domains of the scores and try to find out the reason. The same, we see that often, and I'm also serving on an ethics committee of the Bavarian Chamber of Physicians. We very often see that the apps that are being used and so on are just designed from a perspective of, you know, what the clinical team has from it and the sponsor, but we don't think about, was the patient getting back for feeding that machine? Do they see the change in quality of life? Do they see the change in measurements? Do they get feedback on themselves that they can have a more informed discussion either with the study team or with their GP or whoever that actually explains level of fatigue, also what they're experiencing. So I think what we always need to think of is not only in terms of the guidelines, what's the obligation for it and what's the safe framework for using those tools, but what's the return on engagement for the patient actually to use that in a study. I think that's really important. And the patient community, of course, could help a lot in designing that in a way that it's beneficial for all sides.
Thank you very much. I would like to highlight really the return of engagement for the patient. That is very important message for everybody to understand and take with us. And maybe Denise?
Yes, I think Jan make a very good point, because indeed that I was about to also contribute along this line, because the clinical so-called ECOA, e-clinical outcome assessment, EPRO, are really I would say the obvious application for using the new technologies, and indeed in terms of how far this can serve patients, I think we have to see where we come from. And for instance, we used to have static instruments with fixed question, whatever the numbers were, which were not necessarily tailored for each individual patient. And over the years, after, I would say, intense discussion with investigators and patients, now we are moving more to an approach where we have item libraries, and basically the questionnaires can be built specifically tailored for the patient population. And of course, in that case, based on the item library, you can develop very interactive tools where basically one patient is not going necessarily to answer the same question than another patient in the same study, because his or her situation is completely different with jump question and so on, for instance, depending on the toxicity and the quality of life. So I think gradually, indeed, it's very important to move using the evolution of technologies, e-solutions that are really tailored for the patient, not only, of course, for the study, but also because these are allowed to have specific information on each patient for the investigator to really access to this information and take action for individual patients. So I think we still have to see down the line how far these, I would say, interactive tools and new solutions can indeed contribute not only at the level of the study, but of course the study participant. I have to say that this does not come without challenges, because first of all, when you have an item library, it's not like a fixed questionnaire that you can really validate. So basically, it is made on a case-by-case basis, on a study-by-study basis. So it raises some, I would say, some challenges about the validation, about making sure that we are going, what is the clinical utility, actually, of the specifically developed questionnaire. Not to forget also the translations, because these have to be in the language of each individual patient should be also validated. And finally, of course, the format under which it ends up as an e-version in different devices has to be validated. So it's not a trivial exercise from the organizer, from the sponsor point of view. But I think at least in our environment, and while we have positioned as worldwide leader for quality of life instrument in oncology, we have developed all these services, and of course it's ongoing research and ongoing, I believe, development. What I haven't said is that, of course, all this is subject to pilots, to validation based on small groups of patients, of course, before it is used. So it's also a new form of collaboration with patients, where I think patients can, of course, substantially contribute to help us developing these more patient-centric instrument for patient-centric studies. Thank you.
Thank you for this exciting news. In clinical pharmacology and in medicine, as you know, personalized medicines are our daily bread and butter. It's the goal. But I hadn't heard about personalized ePro questionnaires. That is really fascinating, and I believe, like personalized medicines, they will have quite a bit of they will bring quite a bit of benefit for the patients. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so these are really good and really valid points. And also we had the discussion when drafting the guideline. That's also why we included now in section 4.3 that it's a big recommendation to engage the stakeholders, the participants, and the healthcare professional when designing these tools to make sure that they're actually fit for purpose. And it's also a point where I think sometimes the sponsors do not know the impact it has if they do not do it, because they are not the ones who gets the immediate feedback. That would be the investigator sides. We've seen numerous cases where, because of the tool not being fit for purpose, what happens is that then the patient, of course, will contact their investigators to get assistance, to get help. So it may not even come to the attention of the sponsor that something is really wrong with the system. So it puts a lot of additional burden on the investigator sites as well. And it really causes the participants to lose the overview. And there could be some reason where you really don't want the participant to see their prior answers in the process, but it may be made available to them at a later point. So it has to be, as you also said, a case-by-case assessment of the situation, but it's really a valid focus point.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Then we're going, of course, and it is in my notes here, Rebecca for the sponsor.
That's okay. I also wanted to sort of talk with what Lisbeth had just mentioned, because a lot of sponsors do get feedback, but it's often sort of after the event. So maybe that's something we sort of need to think more about. From a sponsor perspective, we really need to think about what are the important data points to collect and not go collecting all these nice to haves. And, you know, really engage patients, because patients and healthcare professionals can help us develop tools that are appropriate. So if I bring it back to my mum from yesterday, so with her smartphone, she can access a link and read the information. But if you gave her another device that was a little bit more technical, then probably she would struggle. So we also need to make sure that we're not excluding particular types of patients with the technology that we're using. So that's something definitely to consider.
Thank you, Rebecca. Indeed, very important point. As all of us get older and the systems get more complicated in a way for us. The next question is very popular, as you can see. Yes, how can validation of e-systems implemented by sponsor but used at the investigator sites be achieved by the investigator? How can we handle computerized systems at investigational sites that do not meet the computer system validation criteria? How should electronic systems, QMS, e-diaries be validated in the future? I believe Lisbeth has shown in her presentation a visualization related to that, and she will take also this question.
Yeah, so I can see it's also a popular question with 43 thumbs up. So I just want to somehow immediately kill the notion of the investigator having to have responsibility over the sponsor system and the sponsor validation of the system. That is not the intention of this guideline. So the responsibility for the validation of systems that the sponsor deploys is sponsor responsibility. And if you then look at 212 about what is investigator responsibility for sponsor systems, it's things like they have to use them as intended. They have to tell the sponsor who needs to have access. They need to report any incidents, things like that. But it's not investigator responsibility about the sponsor system validation.
Can you look at the second part? How can we handle computer system at the investigator side?
Yeah, so the second part, how should electronic systems, i.e. EQMS, e-diaries, etc., be validated in the future? So that's sponsor responsibility to have that. And then, of course, if you have, and I don't know if that is what is in the question also, if you have a sponsor investigator, that could be, that then the situation is, of course, that you still have some responsibility. The sponsor, then being also the investigator, will have responsibility for choosing a system that is fit for purpose. So, yeah.
Thank you. Lisbeth, would you like to add anything?
No, I just had the impression, but it's an impression that the question could have been meant differently by asking what to do with investigator side systems, example given electronic health record system that do not meet the GCP requirements, because this is a question we often get, and I wanted to point that to Lisbeth, what our view is on that perspective. Example given, say, may lack audit trail functionalities we would usually expect, or the sites may struggle with direct access to data. These are also questions we frequently get.
Yeah, and for this point exactly, that's why we reiterated now or made it even stronger after the public consultation that the sponsor should evaluate the clinical practice system used by the investigator for their fitness for purpose. So, and we deliberately used the word fitness for purpose to say this is not it's not expected to be a full validation effort, for instance, for an electronic medical record. That's the typical example we get. And it depends a little bit on what you use the medical record for. So if you use it as per usual standard by saying, you know, the patient was here for this and that, we included the patient, they signed an informed consent, then you really have to think what are the important things we need to know about a system to be able to trust that, and that is typically things like you just said. Is there an audit trail? How can we trust that nothing has been changed there more than it's a complete, review of what does the electronic record do and who has validated it, and can we see some test documentation? This is not really the case there. Whereas for other systems that are driving primary endpoint, for instance, you really have to look at the risks and say, okay, are those risks we can live with if they do not fulfill all requirements in Section 4? Can we then, as a sponsor, live with the risk? Can it be mitigated in any way? Or is this something where we just have to say that we cannot, you cannot use this system this way and then address that risk?
Thank you. Then we have another popular question. There is an EMA guideline on principal investigator oversight on data. For example, they need to sign on ECRF of each visit of trial participant. Will this guideline be updated with proportionality approach? So it's one of the regulators, Lisbeth or Gabriele.
Yeah, so there we actually, I believe it's already a couple of years ago, we actually made a new Q&A to address this, because we had a good discussion in the inspectors working group about what are our expectations. And the expectations is really not to have, as I also said, a signing off of each ECRF page constantly. Our expectation is more to say, okay, what are the important milestones at which we need some kind of sign off or acknowledgement that these are the data we have, we can endorse from the investigator side. And I would say we also had the discussion that there are many different ways of keeping investigator oversight. And one of them is to maybe look at the reported data to figure out what has my staff, did they misunderstand something? So they need to have some level of oversight, but not endless sign off of each page. And there are other ways also to address the oversight.
Many thanks, Gabriele.
Yeah, I would like to add, because it already said not each page, but visits, and I very well recall that discussion. If there are a lot of visits very close together, we do not even expect every visit, but just consider those clinical trial protocols where you have endpoint criteria, related visits every 3 months. And what is the meaning? Why is this signing for? And that's always a very important question. What is the purpose? Because only if you consider the purpose, you know what's fit for purpose. And the purpose is, on the one hand, a confirmation of the accuracy, but at the same time, it's also the opportunity for the investigator to follow up discrepancies or missing data. And if then the time difference between the collection and this kind of control by the investigator is about months or half a year or a year, investigators are unable to take any corrective and preventive actions by saying, okay, first of all, let's go back. Is this data missing? Did we not collect it? Or is it just not entered? Or if it's discrepant, what happened really at that time? Therefore, the one hand, I mean, we phrase it now, important steps, but even that could fall a bit too short. You have to consider, does it allow to take actions if, as I said, if there are discrepancy or missing data, or if just the collection process doesn't work. So it needs to be reasonable and fit for both purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. This clarifies a lot. I would like now to go back to the questions we have prepared based on the feedback we received from the audience, from the public in preparation of this workshop. And we have a rather complicated sentence in the guideline, I would say, from my point of view. And I believe Gabriele will explain the meaning of the following.
Yeah, that's
activities. Let me read it once more.
Thank you.
Because activities performed by service providers should be conducted by relevant GCP requirements, which may be fulfilled by service providers' existing quality management processes that were not explicitly designed to be GCP compliant, but are still fit for purpose in the context of the trial. Gabriele, over to you.
Yeah, it's difficult to interpret, and there was, I have to say, a lot of discussions about this statement. Nevertheless, the European Party could not really say it's completely wrong. And I give two examples where I personally would say, well, it's acceptable. One example is you have a service provider for computerized systems. The service provider is not completely dedicated to clinical research, but offers his service also in other areas and has a well-established process for computer system validation, which is state-of-the-art, then it would be acceptable that this process, even if it's developed outside of clinical research, is used within the GCP context. Another example, you have a service provider who is specified of the transport of pharmaceutical products and has a well-established process and normally outside of clinical trials, so just in routine care, and has a well-established process for transport under temperature-controlled conditions. And you have now, let's say, a cold chain transport, which process is existing within a clinical trial. You would not expect that service provider to develop something and call it, this is now for clinical trials in the context of GCP. That is where I feel it's just common sense, that this would be acceptable even if those processes were not specifically developed for GCP.
Thank you very much. The example really clarifies. And Peter?
Yes, and as we said at the start of this talk, ICH E6 is a consensus document, and there were really lots of discussions, and this was the text we could come up and agree with among all regions. I'd acknowledge myself, it's a bit convoluted the way it's written, and that was the compromise we could come to, but I think Gabriele explained the examples very, very well.
Yeah, where we had our concerns is that this could be misinterpreted, that service providers that provide service in the context of clinical trials have a known existing quality management system which covers clinical trials. Therefore, here it just talks about processes. So specific processes might fit, but overall a service provider needs to make a gap analysis. If I'm now going to provide service within the context of clinical trials, what does GCP requires? What procedures and processes need to be established, and then make a gap analysis, what is missing and what do I have covered as just explained outside of that context. It's not a leeway, not a waiver for service providers not to have something. Thank you.
Excellent. So this shows for me also how useful such meetings are with panels who know all the background. I believe this control temperature chain is excellent example to understand the situation. We have another question, again, from the ones we have prepared based on the feedback. Should all statistical considerations described in the guideline, in particular section, of course, be included in the protocol, or can they be described in the statistical analysis plan, with a plan referenced in the protocol. And I believe Rebecca will take the lead here.
Yeah, it's actually more the other way around. So the description we have in the guideline is the fact that you might not have a statistical analysis plan. If you're an academic researcher, you might well have everything written into the protocol. So you don't have a stats plan. But from the other way around, you do need to write down in the protocol what is your statistical intent. So what do I intend to do with the statistics, the analysis? So it needs to be in the protocol because the assessors will be taking a look at that to determine is it appropriate with how you're collecting the data and the data that you're collecting to make sure that the analysis is appropriate. So yes, you always need to have the statistical analysis detailed in some format in the protocol, is the short answer.
So now I believe we will take the latest question.
So we need to put another one on screen, but there was a question about the applicability of appendices and if they're applicable. And I think, Rebecca, you wanted to take that. So perhaps verbalize that question. I don't know if it'll be on screen on time. Here we are. And I'm happy for you to answer it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, you've heard how the guideline is set up with principles and annexes, and Annex 1 being sort of how you can interpret the principles, and Annex 2 being sort of additional things to think about with different types of trial design elements and data sources. And then, of course, you've got appendices. So Appendix 1 is the investigator brochure, Appendix B is the protocol, and Appendix C is essential records. So all of those aspects you need for your clinical trial. So yes, the appendices are applicable in any type of trial. Thank you.
Many thanks. And now I believe it would be time to open the discussion to the audience on site and remote. Yes, very good.
Oh,
I cannot really.
So the lady
let's
first
start.
and then Ernesto.
Hmm?
The lady first.
The lady first.
Thank you. Sandra Turk from Kirka. I would like to ask regarding the transparency of clinical trials. They should be registered and the results should be published, and even the results should be communicated with the participants. And I would like to ask you, what are the expectations regarding these principles, especially for the bioequivalence trials? Thank you.
Like to take it, please? So, Rebecca says it's a good question, so over to her.
Yeah, it certainly is a good question. And certainly you'd be surprised how many trials aren't registered and the results available. So, that's something we wanted to make sure that it was clear across all regions, all ICH regions, that you needed to sort of make those results available. But what we also said in terms of participant is that they can ask for them if they want to. So some people perhaps don't want to have their results. And in terms of bioequivalence, bioavailability, we didn't actually sort of specifically think about BA, but it's all encompassing. So, you can also think about it in terms of a bioequivalence trial. Somebody might be interested to know whether they were on the innovator or on the comparator. Thank you.
And to complement to that, as I was speaking with someone yesterday, and they asked around bioequivalence trials and this guideline, and why isn't there a dedicated section for them? And when we were developing this guideline, we realized trials come in all different shapes and sizes, all different phases, and it's very broad, and we wanted to keep a concise guideline. There was a point made about data governance, and we're trying to be proportionate, of course, but in a bioequivalence study with such a small number of trial participants, it's very important that is right, and it's crucial for the application. So obviously you adapt the guideline to the situation at hand, and it was just clear to me, someone raised about the bioequivalence element. This guideline does apply. it's a broad guideline. It applies to various different types of trials, but just explaining, we did think about it, and this was the reason why we didn't have specific sections, but it is applicable and you need to apply it in a proportionate manner accordingly. And Gabrielle, you want to compliment?
A last thought, because I recall yesterday a question about whether the participants should be provided with their clinical trial data. As far as I recall, it was in your presentation, Francois. ICH-GCP says the results and the IMP that was given or taken or administered, not more. It's not about trial data to be made available to the participants, because this would be an overinterpretation and would cause real issues. It's about, again, the results which are published, so clinical study report, and the treatment if there was a randomization. If it's only a single arm, then it's clear. That is what was meant by GCP and how it is written. Thank you.
Yes, that was indeed a good question. We have another intervention now from the panel. Jan?
Yeah, probably just to add to that, that's a conversation we frequently have in our ethics committee where I serve as a lay member, because in advanced disease, where probably clinical trials are last resort, it is essential for patients to be able to access some of the data, for example, the results from specific diagnostics that are made through the trial protocol, because if they need to leave the study, or if they are at the end of the study need to seek other options, it might be essential that they get access to that data. So from that perspective, we often have the discussions about ethical issues around clinical trial protocols, because that data actually needs to be made available if necessary. And I totally understand the issue from a trial methodology perspective, but from a patient perspective, that might be your only chance. And that's why we need to be very open to that.
Yes, Rebecca, then we will go to the audience, the panel, then closes on this question after Rebecca. After Gabrielle, of course.
Jan, you're completely right, but we have just to distinguish, if it comes to GCP, between obligations and options. And it doesn't say if a patient is asking for very good reasons, exactly as you described, for the outcome of a specific whatever, that the treating physician, because it's also, nevertheless, it's an investigator, but it's also a treating physician, shares the outcome of a medical evaluation. It's just that we want to avoid an overinterpretation by saying this is now an obligation that every participant is provided with a full data set. Also, to make that clear, I'm fully on your side. I fully understand where you're coming from, and that's no question that this should be able and should happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Then we'll go back to the audience, because I see some participants very eager. Is it on this question? Who has something to do with this question? No. Then we'll go further. We'll have the gentleman to the second row as the...
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a question for Lisbeth. Artificial intelligence is getting more and more frequent use in clinical trials. And is there an expectation from the inspector working group to have documentation on algorithm audit for an artificial intelligence used in a clinical trial, ready for the inspectors to review? Or if there's not any algorithm audit conducted, will the inspector look at the training data sets and the design of that algorithm?
Thank you, Ernesto, for that tricky question. So, first of all, it was discussed intensely whether we want to include something about AI or not in this guideline. And it's obvious that, AI is not just coming, it's already there, and it's also being used for critical functionality in clinical trials. So about AI, I would say the same kind of main requirements that are already in the guideline applies also for AI. Having said that, there's also a lot of additional considerations. It was not felt at the time that we were able to start harmonizing, having a harmonized view. I think each region is kind of finding their feet on this, and we're well advanced also in finding our feet on that. And we have the GMP is reviewing now Annex 11 and is drafting wording around the use of AI in critical functionality. We also have the discussion in IWG whether we should make that an appendix to the E-guideline about our consideration. A big thing about that is, as you said, the use of the guidelines, the use of the data. So which data were used to train the algorithm, which data were used to test the algorithm, and how do we keep those separate? How do we make sure that no bias is introduced? And of regulatory guidance, that will be coming. I mean, currently at the Danish Medicines Agency, we do have a number of critical questions we'll ask to critical ML applications. And that is one place you could go to see already what our local expectations would be. So, but to now there has not been any. Maybe Peter can comment also on that.
No, absolutely, very good answer. And also, so colleagues are aware, there is a reflection paper on use of AI in medicinal product life cycle available on the EMA website, published back in September 2024. Now, there's a section on GCP. It's incredibly high level. I believe it's like 4 sentences. It's very high level anyway. We know that we need to, we're very well aware of this. And one part for me that I'm quite conscious of, being head of inspections where we cover GMP, GCP and PV, is that we also need to make sure our guidelines are talking to each other and aligned. So it's a very good question. We're well aware of active discussions, and I think there'll be more to come from the GCP IWG on that. Thank you.
Yes, very good, Peter. There is a reflection paper on AI in the EMA website, but it's a general on the medicinal product life cycle. The reason we did a reflection paper and not a guideline is obvious. We don't have enough knowledge, expertise, experience to do a guideline at this stage as regulators. A reflection paper is a starting point. And not to waste more time with my talking, over to Francois.
Thank you. It's a question about the sponsor, and unless I missed it, I could not find information on the guidelines on co-sponsorship, unlike the regulation with Article 72, I think. And I think it's an extremely important aspect. Co-sponsors can be diverse, and it can be a patient organization sometimes. And in the context of international platform trials, I think it's essential. And maybe that will be for our next two.
I see here that the panel has already the place in the guideline. Yes, Gabriele. Mm-hmm.
Immediately, because I very well recall that we covered it in the definition. The definition of the sponsor says an individual, company, institution, or organization that takes, and then the second sentence is a clinical trial may have one or several sponsors where permitted under regulatory requirements. All sponsors have the responsibility of a sponsor set out in this guideline and so on. So it's discussed in the definition in the glossary.
Yes, Rebecca, of course.
So that's a plea, actually. Please read the glossary, because we know that people don't always read the glossary, but there's some really important things in there, thinking about investigator site, so trial site. So have a look at that one. Sorry.
Okay, very good. But if somebody does Control F, co-sponsor, how many hits will come up? 1, 0, 2. Co-sponsor.
Didn't say so.
I think is that the question from Francois was about co-sponsorship, and what you read, Gabriele, I didn't hear the word co-sponsor.
So looking at I did do a control F for
Yes.
co-sponsor, but looking at it on the sponsor, it talks about a clinical trial may have one or several sponsors where permitted under regulatory requirements. So it's co-sponsor, it's just worded in a different way, but
Yes.
it is in there under the glossary, under sponsor.
Then I want to go to the lady in the second row who is like waiting patiently or not so patiently.
Thank you.
Anymore.
Thank you. It's Fatima Jami. And I want to make sure I squeeze this in before the panel concludes. And the question is initially to Elizabeth, but I would welcome the panelists, and I think Rebecca especially, for her input as well. It's around data clarification. And I know you kind of made a remark that say we don't want to be over 6 months. So the question here is around, should there be guidance around the timeline for clarifying data? And I think this is especially relevant in decentralized trials where there are multiple HCPs involved in that process. And there is experience from, when you no longer can access that person, specific HCP, you call them back. So there may be a delay. And I think that's the reality of what it is. But I just wanted to clarify on your comment.
Yeah, so no specific timelines we can give, but it's obvious that the longer you wait, the more difficult it is for investigators or trial participants to remember what actually happened. So if we see changes to, for instance, ePro data that happens 6 months after, we get really suspicious and think, what is this to include a patient that shouldn't have been included, or to change an endpoint or something? And that's why we put in to the guideline the comment that it should be supported by source data around the time of the event. So we would usually not expect, for instance, for ePro data, many corrections at all. And maybe it also talks a little bit into one of the questions that are on the Slido about changing to participants' data and endorsement by the investigator, etc. Because usually what we see for ePros is that it's a system where the patient cannot just change the data. So there's no possibility for that. So if you want change for ePro data, it would typically be a data clarification process initiated by the investigator sites. So what we're saying here is in the guideline is that the sponsor should not just completely disallow that. We would not expect there to be many cases, and it's a case-by-case evaluation, and it has to be supported by source data around the time of the event. So that's it. But we don't have a deadline.
Thank you, Lisbeth. And I believe we have time for one more question, but it was in the second row first.
Thank you. So my name is Justine Rochon. I'm representing FSPI today, and I have also a question to Lisbeth around statistical programming and data analysis. And you mentioned that, and it is also stated in the guideline, that the sponsor should ensure the appropriate and documented quality control of statistical programming and data analysis. And we have a specific question about the sample size calculation. What is your expectation towards the codes, the programs we do? Where should they be documented, and to which extent?
Yeah, so thank you. As I said, and as you will also know, that there are so many programs to be, so many codings in a clinical trial. So, and that's why we need some kind of risk proportionality on that. And we would actually expect a sponsor company to have some kind of good programming practice, which also addresses how do we set the level of QC needed for a specific code. And it will depend on the importance of that programming, the individual programming. We see programs not just for the final analysis, but also for generation of data listings for review, for reconciliation of databases in the trial, etc. And there are many different layers of QC. So double programming or QC of the code, etc. So we do not determine which is the correct level of QC. We would expect you to kind of define what level you think is appropriate. And then we might discuss if for something like sample size, you do not have a sufficient QC of that, but we do not specify which QC is expected.
Thank you.
One final question. I think it was the lady in the front row now.
Thank you, Pirkko Lepola. I'm representing a little bit more the investigator side, so I'm a little bit worried when I listen to this, and especially the patient representative John Geisler. So I was thinking for myself that are we going to in the future, a little bit far away, but very soon, are we going to in the situation where as he said, the patient's role is it feeding the machine, and from my perspective, is it the role for the investigator to act as like a IT technician and supervising the machine? If the other person is feeding the machine, and then the investigator is supervising the machine, meaning that oversighting all the data coming from various sources and platforms and whatever. So is it so that might frighten or it's not attractive anymore for the investigators or the old-fashioned doctors not seeing the patients and just seeing those data instead of the real contacts? I mean, this is just a thought for the future. And also, if there is less visits for the clinic, of course, it might be so that because the old-fashioned trials, there has been also some income for the hospitals to the visits. So is it so that if there's a less income, will there be less interest to participate from the clinical side? I don't know.
We
but
have
this
to,
is yeah.
to strive for a fast answer now because the program is very tight. Who can answer that? Gabriele, 30 seconds, 1 minute.
A very short one. For very good reasons, we in GCP don't talk of decentralized clinical trials, pragmatic clinical trials. We talk of elements. Why? Because we anticipate that the future will be in a combination of on-site visits, still having the contact, still having an immediate interaction between trial participants and their investigators, and only in very well rational, justified cases we have complete decentralized settings. So we had the same concerns, and that's therefore we didn't want to convey the impression that this is a new type of clinical trials. It's more making good use of these design elements for the best meaning of all parties involved.
Thank you. And we close this Q&A session. Thank you to the excellent panel, all of you, and Jan remotely. And bigger thanks to the audience for this lively participation.
So now we are moving to a slightly longer than usual coffee break, I would say, and this is due to us finishing at 2 o'clock today. So we're going to be back at 12:15 sharp, and we'll be leading into a session on essential records and safety management before another panel discussion, before we aim to close at 2 o'clock. So do enjoy your break and be back here, please, at 12:15 Amsterdam time. Thank you. Now, so welcome back, everyone, to this final stretch of this workshop. We are going to cover two remaining areas: essential records, where there have been some changes and clarifications, and indeed proportionality being implemented, and safety management. And then we move to the panel session. For essential records, we have Susanna Norskov, we met earlier, FPA representative, and really looking forward to this session. As I alluded to earlier, we had a lot of public comments about it. Dare I say it, a bit of confusion as well around the public version. And coming back to the consensus nature of ICH, this was one area where we actually had opposing views among the region. One view was that we should be very freewheeling and leave investigators and sponsors decide whatever they want to keep. And the other view is perhaps we need to be more prescriptive. And I think I'm very pleased that what we came to in the end was a proportionate element that's going to help everyone in ensuring they keep the right records. But that was quite a lot of discussions, and it was one where public comments and public consultation actually really helped us get to the right way that we wanted to arrive at. So to thank everyone for the comments there. Without further ado, Susanna, I'll hand over to you now, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And hello, everyone, again, and welcome to this presentation on essential records for the conduct of a clinical trial as included in the E6R3 guideline. I will be your guide as we navigate through the pivotal elements of managing essential records in clinical trials. Today's agenda will go into the nuanced differences between the R2 and R3 guideline concerning the handling of essential records. I will go into the specific requirements or guidance and examine how the principles of fit for purpose, proportionality, and risk-based approaches are intertwined into this section. Additionally, I will go through the best practices for maintaining compliance with these guidance and practical implications. My goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools and critical thinking necessary to effectively manage essential records, ensuring both regulatory compliance and the integrity of clinical trial data. When will you need to create a document and when not? And what is important to retain? So let's go on with it. Next slide, please. And this is the usual disclaimer. We'll just skip over this one. And this one you have seen before. This is the revised structure of the R3. I'm highlighting this one because what I think is important to understand here in this context is that it's only the principles in Annex 1 which contains requirements that must be followed. Everything else in the guideline, specifically in the annexes, is advisory and provides additional guidance. No additional requirements are to be found in the appendices and the Annex 2. So the Appendix A, Investigator's Brochure, I'll just go back. The Appendix B, Clinical Trial Protocol and Protocol Amendment, and then the Appendix C that we are going to look into, the essential records for the conduct of a clinical trial. So unlike the R2 guideline, the R3 separates what is mandatory from what is merely a suggestion or best practice. In this presentation, I will highlight the essential requirements for maintaining records as specified in the Principles section and Annex 1. And then I will delve into the advisory text provided in the Appendix C, which outlines the best practices for keeping critical records during the clinical trial. This approach will help to ensure that everybody involved understands not only what they must do to comply with the guidelines, but also what they can do to enhance the efficiency and reliability of their clinical trials. So, next slide, please. And this is also a question that we had yesterday. So before moving into the requirements for essential records, I would like to highlight one major change from the R2, namely the changed definition of the heading from the R2 essential documents to essential records. The R2 defined essential documents which individually and collectively permit evaluation of the conduct of a study and the quality of the data produced. It was thought that the word document was more related to paperless, whereas the word records covers both paper and data. In R2, the shift is therefore to state that essential records are the documents and the data and relevant metadata in any format associated with the clinical trial that facilitates the ongoing management of the trial and collected to allow the evaluation of the methods used, the factors affecting a trial, and the actions taken during the trial to conduct to determine the reliability of the trial result, proceed, and the verification of the trial that was conducted in accordance with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. Long sentence. Well, also here it includes metadata. And the word metadata is a new concept in the guideline and has found its way to the glossary. It's defined as the contextual information required to understand a given data element. And metadata is structured information that describes, explains, or otherwise makes it easier to retrieve, use, or manage data. For the purpose of this guideline, relevant metadata are those needed to allow the appropriate evaluation of the trial conduct. And the appropriate evaluation in this context is what we also had a discussion about, namely to reconstruct the data. So by attaching the metadata to trial-related data, researchers and evaluators can effectively interpret and use data, ensuring that the trial is conducted with the transparency and accuracy. So just as Rebecca alluded to before, please look also into the glossary as well for important information. So now we're ready for setting the scene, looking into the requirement for essential documents as described in R3. In the overall principle 9, as Lisbeth also was looking into, it is called clinical trials should generate reliable results. So when we are looking at principle 9.1, it is stated that the quality and amount of information generated in a clinical trial should be fit for purpose and sufficient to provide confidence in the trial's result and support good decision making. This means that the data collected should not only be accurate and reliable, but also comprehensive enough to cover all aspects of the trial, and it is essential that the information addresses the specific objectives of the trial and provides clear evidence to support the conclusion drawn. Without such robust data, it would be challenging to make informed decisions regarding the safety and efficacy of the interventions being tested. Going to the principle 9.4, it stated that clinical trials should incorporate, please, next slide, please. Here we are. So in the principle 9.4, the last one of the slide, it stated that clinical trials should incorporate efficient and robust processes for managing records, including data, to help ensure the record integrity and traceability are maintained and that personnel information is protected, and thereby allowing the accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification of the relevant clinical trial-related information. So to safeguard the integrity and traceability of records, clinical trials must adopt efficient and robust record management processes. And these processes include standardized protocols for data entry, validation, storage, and retrieval to prevent data loss or corruption. Additionally, employing advanced encryption technologies and access control mechanisms ensures that the personal data remains confidential and secure. Next slide, please. And finally, in principle 9.5, it stated that essential records should be retained securely by sponsors and investigators for the required period in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. These essential records should be available to regulatory authorities, monitors, auditors, and RBEC as appropriate upon request to enable appropriate evaluation of the trial conduct in order to ensure the reliability of the trial results. In summary, the sponsors and investigators are required to securely retain all essential documents for the specified duration as dictated by the relevant regulatory authorities, and the essential records should be made accessible to the regulatory authorities, monitor and auditors, and the ethics committees as applicable whenever requested. Ensuring that these records are readily available helps to verify compliance with regulatory requirements, assess the integrity of the data, and ultimately guarantee the reliability and credibility of the trial results. Next slide, please. So all through the Annex 1, the investigator, sponsor, and data governance sections specify requirements for retaining essential documents. One thing worth mentioning are the specific requirements for the investigational product records, which are outlined in both the investigator and the sponsor section. It's emphasized that the investigator must maintain control over all essential documents and records generated by the investigator or institution before and during the trial. The investigator should ensure that these records are available, accessible, and readable, while also preventing unauthorized access and accidental or premature destruction. This responsibility extends to metadata, as outlined in the data governance section. The investigator is tasked with retaining all records for the required retention period, ensuring that they are preserved according to the standards of preservation, accessibility, and protection against unauthorized access and alterations. Similarly, the sponsor is responsible for retaining all sponsor-specific essential records. The sponsor must communicate in writing with investigators, institutions, and relevant service providers about the retention requirements of these essential records and notify them when the trial-related records are no longer necessarily according to regulatory standards. Furthermore, should there be any transfer of ownership of the essential records, the sponsor must report this to the appropriate regulatory authorities to ensure all legal and compliance requirements are met. If there are changes in the investigator or in the trial sponsorship, the sponsor must promptly inform the investigator to maintain the integrity and continuity of the trial's conduct and data management. And next slide, please. So now we are moving to the Appendix C, the essential records for the conduct of clinical trial. Appendix C provides comprehensive guidance on the types of records that should be retained throughout the clinical trial process. As I just spoke to, the Appendix C does not include any additional requirements, as these requirements are described in the principal section as well as in the Annex 1, as I've just been alluding to. The appendix aligns with the R3 concepts, which emphasizes being a fit-for-purpose, flexible, and proportionate. This means that while the appendix offers important directions on record keeping, it also allows for flexibility and proportionality in how these records are managed and maintained. The Appendix C in itself is divided in 3 sections, where the section C1 corresponds to the previous R2 section 8.1 on introduction. In alignment with the R3 concept, the introductions to the section emphasizes in even more terms that the R2 that a risk-based and fit-for-purpose approach to the collection and filing of essential records should be undertaken. Instead of being prescriptive, the R3 now provides guidance on what makes a record essential. It's stated in the first paragraph in the section that many records are generated before and during the conduct of the trial. The nature and extent of those records generated and maintained are dependent on the trial design, its conduct, application of risk-proportionate approaches, and importance and relevance of that record to the trial. The section C2, Management of Essential Records, and the C3, Essentiality of Records, have been undergone a huge revamp, and I will go through more into detail on these later slides. So next slide, please. So, the section C2, Appendix C, describes how to manage essential records. The first paragraph here describes that records should be identifiable, version controlled, and include necessary authors, reviewer, and approvers as appropriate. And records being easily identifiable ensures transparency, accountability, and accuracy in maintaining and updating records. Secondly, arrangements must be made for access and management of essential records by sponsors and investigator institutions, even if activities are transferred to a service provider. This is necessary to guarantee that the important documents are available and handled correctly even after the transfer. Essential records should be maintained in repository by both the sponsor and investigator institution, known as the Trial Master File, TMF, and Investigator Site File, ISF, respectively, but it's not needed to maintain essential records in duplicates, but reference from the storage system managed by both the sponsor and the investigator for their own records. A record of the location of essential records, including source records, must be maintained, and the storage system should allow proper identification, search, and retrieval. This should be true irrespective of the type of media used. And next slide, please. So moving on to the next paragraph, it stated that essential records should be collected and filed promptly, but some records should be in place before the trial and updated as needed. This will assist in the successful management of a trial. Records must be retained in a way that ensures they remain complete, readable, and readily available to regulatory authorities, with any alteration traceable. The documents should be directly accessible upon request by regulatory authorities, monitors, and auditors. Moving into where the documents should be filed. So original documents should be retained by the party who generated them, and access to or copies of relevant records should be available to both sponsors and investigators or institutions. And the next paragraph is about how to fulfill responsibility for both the sponsor and the investigator. So the investigator and sponsor needs access to each other's essential records during the trial and retain them afterwards. The location of records may vary, and records like SUSAR reports accessed via a sponsor-provided portal must be kept by the investigator at the end of the trial. Next slide, please. So more to the management of essential records. When a copy permanently replaces an original record, it must meet the certified copy requirements. And also the certified copy is now defined in the R3 glossary. And that is a copy irrespective of the type of media used of the original record that has been verified by a data signature or by generating through a validated process to have the same information as the original, including relevant metadata where applicable. So slightly different from the wording which were in the R2 definition. Certain records are typically maintained only by the sponsor or investigator institution depending on their nature, such as data analysis or confidential participant information. So it's necessary that the sponsor and the investigator trial master files, it's not necessary that they mirror each other because there are these differences. And also, as a word of caution, it's stated that careful consideration should be given to the sharing of records when there are blinding considerations and where records are subject to applicable data protection laws. The sharing of such records must be approached via a thorough understanding of the potential risks and must incorporate measures to mitigate any breaches or confidentiality. And finally, that some essential records may not be trial-specific but related to investigational product, facilities, or processes and can be retained outside the trial-specific repositories. Examples hereof are the investigator's brochure, the master service agreement, SOPs, and validation records. And next slide, please. So, in the ICS E6R1 guideline was very prescriptive regarding the expectations for which documents to include in which file the document was expected and how to retain and update them. This means that it provided specific instructions on the type of documents required for clinical trials, where these documents should be stored and how they should be maintained and updated throughout the trial process. The ICH E6R2 guideline introduced a more flexible approach. It included a sentence stating that the essential documents for the trial should be supplemented or may be reduced where justified based on the importance and relevance of the specific documents to the trial. This has meant that the guidance allowed for adjustments to the required documents based on their significance and relevance to the specific trial, as long as these adjustments were justified before the trial began. Now, the R3 document includes an even more proportionate and fit-for-purpose approach. As discussed, the principles and Annex 1 outline the high-level requirements, and Section C.3.1 provides a tool to assess whether a record is to be regarded as an essential record that needs to be retained. The criteria for determining essential records involved evaluating their legal, operational, and historical value. Legal value ensures compliance with the regulations and laws. Operational values considers the document's role in the daily functioning and decision-making processes, and historic values assesses the document's contribution to the organization's legacy and knowledge base. The assessment of whether to consider a document an essential record and thereby needed to be included in the trial master file does not need to be documented, and I will go a little more into details in the coming slides. So next slide, please. So the Appendix C, as I said, includes assessment criteria to determine whether a record is essential and therefore has to be retained. Again, even though conducting such an assessment on the essential records is critical for the integrity and compliance of the clinical trial, it's important to highlight that this assessment does not need to be formally documented. This approach ensures that while the necessary records are kept, the process remains efficient and not overly burdensome for the trial administrators. I tried to map these into 6 high-level categories. Those categories are documents, training or qualifications, data and metadata, IMP, lab activities and sample management, and finally participant information and safety handling. And such, just to provide some words on this one. So in this document category, the assessment includes whether a document is submitted to or issues by regulatory authorities or IRB, including any related correspondence or any documented decisions or approvals. If so, it would be considered an essential record. In the same category, an essential record would also include trial-specific procedures or plans as well as agreements. The assessment in the training category includes considerations on education, training, and experience to demonstrate preparedness to perform activities to be done in the trial. This goes for investigators, sponsors, and service providers. It should be mentioned here that a proportionate approach for documented delegated activities is now included in the guidelines. So in situations where activities are performed as part of the clinical practice, delegation documentation may not be required. For the data and metadata category, determination of which records would be essential will follow an assessment whether those are needed to allow the appropriate evaluation of the conduct of the trial. This is also including source verifying the existence of trial participants and validation of computerized systems. Documents that includes information on the IMP itself, as well as labeling information about shipment, storage, packaging, dispensing, randomization, and blinding, would be assessed to be essential records. Further, also traceability and accountability from release to dispensation and administration to the trial participant, return and destruction or alternative disposition would also be that. The next category I have tried to define is the lab activities and evidence that other tests are fit for purpose, as well as the collection, chain of custody, processing, analysis, and retention or destruction of biological samples. And the last category is the trial participants. Essential records would here include the information provided to the patient, consent appropriately obtained and maintained, further documentation of recruitment and pre-screening activity, as well as documentation of participant identity and chronological enrollment are essential, as well as oversight of the trial participant safety during the trial, including reporting requirements. Across all these categories, documentation of sponsor oversight would be considered an essential document, as well as any documentation that includes conduct of the relevant trial procedures were performed. This also includes documentation of procedures which are included in the data governance section. And next slide, please. So, as alluded to previously, the R3 has been moving away from being prescriptive and to encourage a proportionate and fit-for-purpose approach. The essential records table have moved away from stipulating what needs to be in place before, during, and after the clinical trial, as well as where the documents needed to be filed. This new approach aims to provide greater flexibility to researchers and clinical trial administrators, allowing them to tailor their documentation processes to the specific needs and circumstances of each trial. By shifting the focus from rigid requirements to more adaptable guidelines, the R3 framework supports the efficient and effective management of essential records while still ensuring compliance with regulatory standards. Instead of one-size-fits-all mandate, the essential record table now serves as a reference tool that highlights the key documentation areas and offers guidance on best practice. This change empowers teams to exercise professional judgment and adapt their documentation strategy to better align with the trial's unique objectives and operational context. Moreover, this evolution in documentation requirements is expected to enhance the overall trial quality by encouraging thoughtful consideration of what records are truly necessary and how they should be maintained. It promotes a culture of accountability and continuous improvement, fostering a more dynamic and responsive clinical trial environment. And next slide, please. The table includes records that, if produced, they are considered essential and should be retained. These records play a critical role in ensuring the accuracy, integrity, and compliance of the clinical trial process. They include, but are not limited to, the trial protocol, informed consent forms, investigator's brochure, case report forms, and finally the study report. An asterisk in the table identifies those essential records that should be generally in place prior to the start of the trial. Examples of this are highlighted by a red circle in this slide, and it's imperative to maintain these documents meticulously as they provide a comprehensive account of the trial's progression and are invaluable for audit and inspection purposes. The proper retention of those records helps safeguard the reliability of the trial outcomes and supports the regulatory submissions and future research endeavors. And next slide. So this is my summary slide. So the updated guideline provides an instructions on the essential records that must be kept for clinical trials. These documents are important for ensuring the data's accuracy and reliability. Many records are created both before and during a clinical trial. The type and amount of these records depend on the trial's design, conduct, risk management, and how important each record is to the trial. The guidelines offer instructions on what these essential records should contain and how they should be maintained. Additionally, the guideline also includes a table of examples of essential records such as protocols, investigators' brochures, informed consent, and regulatory requirements. Lastly, the guideline explains how the sponsor and the investigator should assess their other essential records to fulfill their responsibilities. This approach ensures that everyone involved in a clinical trial is aware of their compliance duties and ways to improve their trial's efficiency and reliability. I think that concludes my presentation for today. So thank you for that one.
Susanna, thank you very much. And at a high level, what I'm taking away from this really is when it comes to essential records, like anything else in the guideline, you need to apply a proportionate approach in relation to what records should be generated and kept. The list is not a checklist in the appendices, but it's a good steer. And I think this was one area of confusion because we had discussions about getting rid of the list altogether, but we found that that was causing considerable confusion on the ground. It's a good steer, and you should really consider it and maybe justify if you're not going to keep certain records, but really think about what should be kept there. And I think it does give the power in the investigators and sponsors in relation to the level of records they generate and keep. Thank you very much. There was a very good overview. We are going to have a very interactive panel session, and we're going to be coming back to perhaps considering some practical examples as well to discuss around the essential records piece. But I want to now move over and looking at the safety management component. And Gabriella, you're going to give us an overview here. Thank you very much indeed, and please, the floor is over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, I have only 10 slides, so you can relax. Nevertheless, I try to give a good overview about what's new in Revision 3 in relation to safety management, and also to put it into one place, which allows you to understand the concept as I said, by providing an overview. So next slide, please. It's a disclaimer, yeah. Next slide, please. Just for the outline, I start with the principled section and then move to investigator, sponsor, and also shed some light on glossary terms. Principles. Next slide, please. What's really new, if you look at Revision 2, it really mainly describes safety reporting requirements. And there's only very little in Revision 2 about safety assessment. And that's why we felt, well, safety report and shouldn't let people feel free. It's more important that a safety review takes place both on the side of the investigator and on the side of the sponsor. And therefore, the revised principle 1 says in 1.2, the safety of the participants should be reviewed in a timely manner as new safety information becomes available. And safety information is a broad term, can be safety information from new completed preclinical studies. It can be safety information from the ongoing clinical trial, from parallel trials, from the pharmaceutical, from the IMP part. So it's a broad term here, new safety information, which could have an impact on participant safety, their willingness to continue in the trial or the conduct of the trial. Okay, next slide, please. We now move, how is this principle embedded in the investigator section? And here the most important section is 2.7, participant medical care and safety reporting. What is new here is we had discussions already in the past what to do with adverse events which occur before IMP is administered, because the definition for adverse events says something that occurs after IMP is administered. So, so far we had nothing for this, and therefore we now included in the subsection a reference for unfavorable medical events. We don't call it adverse events because it don't fulfill the requirements, occurring in participants before IP administration, example given during screening, or example given a very, I have to say, prominent example is during washout periods when you stop the treatment, the previous treatment, and then something can occur. But only, again, this is something, again, if required by the protocol, so the sponsor should consider when drafting a protocol, is there a risk of those events and how shall they be reported, and then also provide a template and a procedure for that. Then next one is also to tackle an issue because for serious adverse events already, I mean, GCP from the beginning, also including revision 2, required an immediate reporting by the investigator. But what does immediate means? And therefore we now clarified after the investigator reasonably becomes aware of the event. It still, let's say, requires some interpretation, but you can't expect an investigator to report something he just doesn't know. And what now reasonably, I mean, everything should be done that the investigator gets that information, but at the same time, that is now, let's say, pushing in a specific direction. Also something which is, by already very well established, but wasn't mentioned in ICH E6 so far, is that investigators should provide a causality assessment on the reports of serious adverse events to the sponsor. The science firm already asked for this, but this is now also embedded. It's more for completeness. And also because we have different rules in different regions, also clarifying here that the investigator might be obliged to provide information on reported deaths of trial participants to authorities, again, if this is based on existing regulatory requirements. We now, next slide, move to the sponsor already. Not investigator, sorry, there's another one. But this is something we explained already yesterday, that the investigator should be provided with timely access to data by the sponsor, to any safety-related data, timely access by the sponsor, and it reflects then the corresponding section in the sponsor part, and is responsible for the timely review of data, including the relevant data from external sources that can have an impact on eligibility, as an example, treatment, safety, also potentially the patient willingness to continue in the clinical trial and so on. And also to avoid an overinterpretation, it was added that the protocol may provide exceptions for access, for instance, to protect blinding. Next slide, please. Now we are moving to the sponsor. Yeah. Here, again, we implemented this responsibility of the sponsor to not only to report to regulatory authorities, SUSAs, but also for a timely review of all relevant safety information, potentially after prior aggregations, or where appropriate, which may result in protocol amendment or an amendment or new version of the investigator's brochure, in a reconsent or any related documents. And it also explains the purposes of it. So assess whether there's any new data that may affect. Okay. in those cases, it's underlined that these occurrences, so these new data that have such a high level impact, that these should be then also immediately, or let's say in a timely manner, communicated to the participants, to the investigators, to the ethics committee and regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. This is now the new subsection 3.13.2 about safety reporting, and it also includes something which is already well established, the assessment of expectedness of any serious adverse event. But what it does, it links ICH E6 with ICH E2F by saying, well, what is the basis for the assessment of expectedness? It's the applicable reference safety information, a term that is defined, as I said, in ICH E2F. The next, the D, is also more to tackle an issue that specifically in large clinical trials in a high morbidity population where you might have a frequent occurrence of SUSARs, nevertheless in a stage where potentially the safety profile is already well known, that it should be undertaken in a manner that reflects the urgency of action required. As I said, taking into consideration the evolving knowledge of the safety profile of the product in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, saying this timely manner requires a completely different interpretation in an early phase than in a late phase in a population or in a clinical research clinical research project where the safety profile is already well known. And it also underlines that in some regions, periodic reporting of line listings with an overall safety assessment may be appropriate. And E, exactly the other way around, is about urgent safety issues requiring immediate attention or action, and that these should be reported to the IRB, IECs, and the regulatory authorities and the investigators without undue delay and in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So you see, we also embedded some proportionality into this safety assessment and reporting to avoid an overinterpretation and, let's say, a kind of reporting which is not manageable and doesn't lead to, is not actionable, doesn't lead to the right consequences. So that is the overall aim of these changes to safety assessment and reporting. Next slide, please. And this section 3.13 was mainly embedded to align ICH E6 with ICH E19 by including this reference that alternative arrangements for safety reporting can be implemented in line with ICH E19, which describes a selective approach to safety data collection in specific late-stage pre-approval or post-approval clinical trial. Not every late-stage pre-approval clinical trial can make use of it if it's example given clinical development in an orphan disease where you have reasonably small clinical trials. You might not reach that stage already pre-approval. Even the immediate post-approval clinical trials, the safety profile still requires some completion. But for products where the clinical trial development included more than, let's say, a 4-digit number of trial participants with the same characteristics, and you have therefore a very good basis for evaluating the safety profile, that in those cases, example given, specific adverse events do not longer need to be collected, whereas everything which reaches the threshold of serious or leads to trial discontinuation or whatever, that, so you have to look at E19, it describes which should always be collected. And 397, just to mention it, IDMC was also these committees were so far not namely included in revision 2. So therefore it was here now stated included sponsor may consider establishing an IDMC to assess the progress of a clinical trial, including the safety data and the efficacy endpoints at intervals, and to recommend to the sponsor whether to continue, modify, or stop a trial. Then let's move to the next slides, which handles or deals with data handling. Again, this is reflecting the one I presented for the investigators. It here says that the sponsor should ensure that the investigator has timely access to data collected in accordance with the protocol and so on. But we have already discussed this yesterday, so I do not go into more detail. Next slide, please. Yeah, now I move to glossary terms. If you have a look at the adverse drug reaction definition, then it very much reflects, also not word by word, but in the meaning it reflects the existing definition in ICH E2A. The only what was added is that we know that the level of certainty about the relatedness of an adverse event to the treatment with the investigational product, that this varies. And we said as soon as there is a high level of certainty between that this specific observed adverse drug reaction is suspected to be medicinal product related, then it should be included in the reference safety information or in the investigator's brochure. So it's not what we wanted to convey is you have to have an annual review, but you might have to make an update earlier if you have a new serious adverse drug reaction, specifically which reaches this high level of certainty. Okay. Next slide, please. And it's not limited to serious adverse events. I want to correct myself. Also, let's say important adverse drug reactions should be included. Now, for the serious adverse event, we aligned the definition, the existing definition, with ICH E2A and ICH E19 by including in E6 the important medical event. And important medical events are defined as those that may not be immediately life-threatening or result in death or hospitalization, but that may jeopardize the participant or that may require intervention to prevent serious outcomes. I know now you might ask, okay, where can I find what constitutes an important medical event? At least for the post-marketing authorization, there is a list existing, well-established, as far as I know, also available on the EMA webpage. So there you can get ideas what should fall under this definition. Yeah, and next slide, please. It's about SUSARs. SUSARs, so suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions, well established in Europe, definition in the CTR, now also a new glossary term in ICH E6. Again, not word by word reflecting the European CTR definition, but very, very close, so absolutely no contradictions. First, as is for suspected, so saying there is a reasonable possibility that a drug caused the adverse drug reaction, unexpected, and that's, I would say, very close to the European wording, an adverse reaction, the nature or severity of which is not consistent with the applicable product information. What we added here is that the product information, RSI, can be the investigator's brochure or alternative documents according to applicable regulatory requirements. Example given from marketed products, it can be the SMPC or leaflet. And last, S for serious, and we just said here in the definition in revision 3, look above for serious adverse events. Yeah, that was my last slide. Yeah. So that is for you a brief summary of the changes in relation to safety assessment and reporting from revision 3, and happy to take any questions, sorry, to provide answers to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Very clear, very concise, great overview. Thank you. And I think we're going to have quite an interactive panel session now that we're going to move over. You have met most of the people on our panel session. We're joined by Gabriella, Rebecca, Peter from the investigator side, and Susanna. We do have a new member. We have Elke Stahl from the Bee Farm, and Elke is a senior expert in clinical trials at the Bee Farm in Germany, and also the chair of the Safety CTCG subgroup, so she'll be able to help us in answering some of the safety issues. And I see you're online, Elke. Thank you very much for joining us for the panel. So I'd like to kick off maybe, and this panel is going to be focusing on essential records and safety, so two separate elements. And perhaps the first question we would like to start off with is around the essential records piece. Now, so the question is that the reconstruction of clinical trial has now changed to allow direct access to records for the appropriate evaluation of the conduct of the trial. What's that mean? We used to use the term reconstruction. That was a very well understood term. And now we've changed to appropriate evaluation, direct access to allow for appropriate evaluation. Why has this changed, and what are the implications? And Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you for that, please.
Thank you. Yes, it is a good question. You know, people do look to see the terminology changes. And yeah, if you think about reconstruction, what do we mean there? It means sort of building something back together. So I likened it to something that happened about 20 years ago. So I'm sure all of you might remember, because it was an international incident, or made international news. There were some Chinese vases at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And a chap went to tie his shoelace and tripped and knocked the 3 vases over and smashed them to smithereens. So, of course, it made the news. But luckily, the museum were able to reconstruct them. So if you go to the Fitzwilliam now, you'll see those vases, and they look like they did before the accident. So they've been able to be reconstructed. But can you really do that with a clinical trial? And that was the discussion we had with other EWG members, because it's almost like making the trial up again. Whereas actually what you're wanting to know is, what was the story of what happened in that clinical trial? So how do you have the records to allow the evaluation of the conduct of that trial? And so that's why we changed the terminology, because it wasn't sort of resonating across all of the regions. And as for implications, well, the expectations are still the same.
Thank you. Very clear. It's a terminology change then. We still expect appropriate evidence there for us to know what was conducted, but not to reconstruct the whole thing. Very clear, very clear. Thank you. It's good to clarify that. I'd like to move on then to a second question around the revised section on essential records. And the question is, what impact do you expect on the current trends to bigger and larger TMFs, trial master files, and investigator site files? And that question is for Gabriella first, and then Peter from the investigator side, please.
Yeah, Susanne had underlined very nicely that it requires a decision whether something is needed to allow the to tell the story about trial conduct or not. So it requires really a proportionate approach, and not just, I mean, filing whatever comes in. It needs some organization. And from that perspective, I would believe if it's meaningful interpreted, the essential records need not to be necessarily more. Specifically for the sponsor, we have to consider that there is already since, 15 years, this DIA TMF reference model existing, which is well established, also used by service provider to create electronic folders where documents can be placed. So I would say, well, even also from that perspective, if such models were meaningfully used, we will not see a big change. For investigators, I'm more hand over now to Peter, telling us how you feel about it. Thank you.
Many thanks for this question, and I'll be happy to address it from, again, the investigator's perspective. I think it's fair to say that it may not only be about the amount of information in the ICF, but also about the accessibility and management. So let me explain that. I believe that the volume may not be so important because with the advent, for example, of electronic ICF, hybrid ICF, we manage to, let's say, optimize the structuration by using folder system, hierarchical organization. Also, although some requirements may be questionable, for example, like excessive signing of safety reports or CVs, they are not so common. And also with and this has already been mentioned several times, risk-based strategies and remote monitoring, I believe that it may lead to a decrease of unnecessary administrative burden. However, there is one significant challenge that the investigators have been facing, and it's been already some time, and it has been a lack of standardization across investigators' platforms, which have been used by different sponsors. So imagine you have 3 trials from different sponsors, so it is quite probable that you will have 3 different platforms. And this leads to operational inefficiencies, added administrative burden, and also fragmented workflow, because if you are working on these 3 trials and you have to switch, you have to again terminate and start again somewhere else. And this is due to several causes, including multiple training requirements, diverse authorization processes, login credentials, and password rotations. There is also operational differences. And last but not the least, there is also differences in terms of quality and user friendliness. So I believe that the R3 indeed brings possibilities to optimize the volume of ICF, but I think that we urgently need to accelerate the solutions as far as how to optimize the accessibility and management. And this may perhaps only be done by some sort of guided standardization, including harmonization of the design and also functionality.
I answer now for everybody. That was excellent points. Really, really good points. Wonderful. And I look now at my FPR colleagues because I believe, I mean, it's absolutely clear if you have a number of clinical trials and you have to manage your essential documents at an investigator site within so many different systems. This is a real challenge, and we all know also from other work places where we have to manage information in different systems, how burdensome it is. So some activities, group set up or whatever, harmonization across at least the large sponsor companies would really help investigators here to have less burden. So it's again about investigator burden. So, but this can't be, in my view, it can't be solved by regulators. It's a task for sponsor companies, right?
Do you want to come back in, Rebecca?
Yeah, it certainly is a problem. We've seen it with ECRFs in the past, and now the issue's changed onto investigator site files. I know there is some work that's ongoing about sort of standards, so that you kind of have like a front end, and then you can be pushed into whichever particular repository that it's going to. But I think that's a little bit of a way off at the moment, but certainly something to think about. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you. Really good discussions. A question we received via the Slido, and it's a very good question. The question is, well, okay, you've helped us trying to be a bit more proportionate, but what do you not regard as essential then? And there's a question around the list itself and looking through it, and what isn't essential? What would we not need to keep? I mean, I think maybe just to preface it, all trials are different. The essentiality is going to depend on that data and how important it is. But perhaps if I could use some examples from my own point of view, maybe you had a low-risk trial, maybe you're using a product already on the market. Maybe we already talked about IMP and accountability and how there are tailored standards there in that regard. Maybe it's something dispensed in a community pharmacy, so the level of accountability records kept would not be the same as what you'd expect from other trials. Indeed, maybe if it didn't have any special storage conditions for authorized products, then keeping a temperature log, you'd need to question that. CVs and of all of your staff. I think E6 talks about the PI. Even then, we could accept, for example, a central folder with CVs if the same PIs are used in multiple different trials. And what is the merit about keeping CVs for every single staff member on the clinical trial? These types of things, I think, have already actually probably been there, but it's become standard practice in some quarters to keep that information. But my colleagues, do you have anything else you'd regard from that question to try and get the memory going there? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm only meant to be the moderator. But okay. Okay, good. From an essential records point of view, now where are we there? Maybe it's time actually to pause and leave the floor on the essential records piece. Any questions, please reflect and think. Actually, I do have a question from the floor. Stefano, earlier you had an excellent question about the QMS investigator side, and it kind of fits under the essential records, so please.
Yeah. Based on new revision 3 and also based on the ICH E8, is it now mandatory or suggested for the experimental site adopt a quality management system with SOP models, structured documents?
Good question, and this really is around a QMS applied to investigator sites. Do they need to have a QMS? Do they need to have lists of SOPs? And this is something I think we had discussed previously at the Inspectors Working Group, for example, in Europe, where it really depends on the types of activities they're doing and how necessary a QMS would be and how valuable it would be in that scenario. We know some investigator sites perhaps run many trials. Maybe they're running phase 1s as well, where a QMS will be very helpful to help them do what they do. SOPs will be very helpful. But then there are investigators, maybe they could be running a non-commercial trial, maybe they're not running many trials, and you'd have to question, do they really need a QMS? Do they need SOPs to be generated? So you need to take that proportionate approach, and what we don't want is a situation that an investigator are generating SOPs for the sake of it when they're not using it and they're not useful. But does anyone want to supplement that from the panel here or otherwise? I hope that's Gabriella, please.
I just can say I contributed to an activity 15 years ago, most probably, where our Ministry of Research set up a fund for creating SOP templates for investigator sites. So not everyone needs to start from the scratch. They need to be customized. But because we also felt exactly as Peter was saying, again, long time ago, that investigator sites, specifically those being frequently involved in clinical research, like universities, medical schools, that they would definitely benefit from having some standard SOPs. And I don't know the number, it was about 20 SOPs really covering, let's say, example given, safety assessment or safety reporting. People really benefit from having those SOPs because they can train newcomers coming into their team easily by saying, okay, make yourself familiar, and then we talk about it, and then you can start. So I would say it's for the best of investigator side to consider themselves how much time does it take and resources does it take to create those SOPs, and what is a long-term benefit? If you are just, I mean, occasionally participating in clinical trials and also, let's say, don't know which one, then you might ask yourself why to take these efforts. But I would say, well, it's worth to consider it at least. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And overall, the message here is R3 isn't implementing a new requirement there. And that's also important to hit home. Now, so from the floor on essential records, you must all have burning questions. There we are in the back, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Smith with FPR. So everyone's seen the statement around it's not necessary to capture every decision about the essentiality of every record. But from your point of view as of quality colleagues and inspectors, what would be your challenge to understand the organization's approach when you come in to look at that? You know, what questions would we need to be ready to answer to get across our interpretation and implementation of that approach? Excellent question. Gabriella, do you want to take that? I think just first thing, maybe when you're reflecting, we did, and there was a discussion around this. An assessment needs to take place, whether something's essential or not. There's a definite statement in there that says such assessment, whilst important, is not required to be documented. And that's because we didn't want this situation that you're giving a level of freedom, but then you're tying it down by saying if you decide not to keep something, you need to document it. And then that's kind of almost defeating the purpose. Having said that, though, if you feel comfortable for documenting the thought process, I mean, I assume there's going to be a level of discussion there. It's not precluding people from doing that, is one point as well. But when it comes about the thought process, I think, as we had talked about earlier, really considering how essential, sorry, it's called essential records, how necessary it is to really be able to reevaluate that trial, meet the primary endpoints, and essentially that you can see it's been conducted in an appropriate manner, and all those critical factors. Now I'll hand over to you, Gabriella, please. You'll do a better job than me.
It is a difficult question to answer because in the end, I have to say within a sponsor organization, example given, you have this split between QA and cleanups, and QA colleagues, auditors, they should know what they would like to see, what they consider essential for evaluating the trial conduct, specifically for important decision taking, in case of any occurrences, what's the kind ever, that then the documentation is available. So I know that this might cause discussions during an inspection, but as I said, if auditors are included in that discussion in cases where there are doubts, and they can then give their input, okay, would we need this to evaluate the conduct, then I would say you are hopefully on the safe side. But we can't provide more than what is now explained in R3. It's at least I can't provide more recommendation to you.
I think it's something that is going to come back from the inspectors working group from a training perspective as well. Very important for us. Rebecca, you want to come in here, please?
Yeah, I'm reading an interesting book at the moment, and it's not a storybook. It's called Hyperfocus actually, but the book has some bits on the side. So you read the text and then there's some interesting, snippets on the side. But actually you don't need to read the snippets to get hold of the story. So the question is, does the information that you have tell the story of the trial? That's the key aspect, I would say.
Anyone else want to contribute? I would say as well, we said earlier, it's not a checklist with that list, but it is a good guide and a good steer. From an inspector's point of view, I mean, Kim and I inspected a trial where if we didn't have that list, we mightn't have seen anything. So it's a good steer, it helps, and there's the practical approach as well on top.
from the floor on essential records. Otherwise, I'll move to the safety piece, but we can come back when people have reflected, as well as we have until a quarter to the hour for the panel, if people can bear the pace. Maybe we move over to safety, and the first question here, Elke, to forewarn you online. The question is, R3 mentions requirements in SUSAR reporting. Can you please confirm that relevant EU legislation will apply? And I suppose from the outset of this question, right at the beginning of this event, we did talk about legislations being of primary importance and having a higher level than the guideline, which I think answers it. But Elke, go ahead.
No, actually, you answered it. Regulation always is what counts, and a guideline is a recommendation, and therefore the rules as of CTR apply for sure. And also, I already received some questions from some sponsors where they were confused about how to report in Europe, due to that the R3 is now mentioning you should inform national competent authorities, ethics, as well as investigators. And as you know, the CTR has a concept of member state, and your reporting rule of a SUSA is vigilance, and that covers national competent authorities and ethics. It's up to us how we organize to really get access to information needed. And the same for the annual safety report, which is submitted via the CT system. If you look on all notifications, they are also via CITES and to the member states. And therefore, I think it's well covered, and nothing different, except that you just have one submission route now left, while for the investigators, this is not covered in the CTR, and I think we had it taken up in the question answer document in UTALEX, so that you inform the investigators proportionate, risk-based, what is needed for your risk mitigation too. And it could be, for example, the update of the safety profile. They should need to know if they have to do some risk mitigations, and maybe line listing if appropriate. So if that's covering it, thanks.
Thank you very much. And another point earlier around, unless someone wants to compliment to that, Gabriela, yes, of course.
Only very short, really, please, before asking those questions, read R3 carefully, because really we have specifically in the safety reporting section, we have added more or less after each and every ABCD in accordance with applicable regulation, because we knew there are differences. So nobody should now feel has to stick exactly to this wording if there is existing rules and regulations in that regions, as explained by Elke, which have preference.
And if you alternate from the rules, you can define in the protocol. That's also given in the CTR article. Is it 40 or 41? I think it's 41. So you can adapt your safety reporting, but then it needs to be in the protocol, and that's fine.
Thank you very much. On the strand of different types of documents and so on, the important medical event list, the IME list on the EMA website, was referenced during the slide, and there was a question which came in. It said, decision whether an AE meets definition of IME was always in the domain of the clinician. Both on the PI and the sponsor side, the EMA IME list was used only as a reference. Now, in your presentation, you mentioned that we should refer to the EMA IME list only. Can you please comment? And I think it's a misinterpreted. But Gabrielle, can you maybe clarify, because that's very important, I think. Thank you.
I have not even included it in my presentation. I just mentioned verbally that if somebody is asking him herself whether this might be an important medical event, then it helps to look. That's how I phrased it. So it's a support for a decision taking, but it's not, because I also mentioned that this is a list from the post-marketing pharmacovigilance. It provides help, but it's not at all binding or predicting or something. It's support for that decision taking. That's how I hopefully explained it also during my presentation. If not, please take now note how I explained.
And maybe to fill in here, though, Gabriela, I think it's not a checklist, and it is depending on your safety profile, your stage of development. If you need to pick some of the important medical events or not. We have taken this wording of important medical events up actually in the question and answer document for hospitalization, because we are here also not so strict, but also an administration to emergency room is maybe to be noted. So and here we have taken up this IMI thoughts to make it more proportionate.
Thank you. Good example. Thank you. One clarification to come back on the earlier question about legislation and GCP, just to make it crystal clear, we know the clinical trial regulation needs to be complied with, it's in law. And also in Europe, it does reference that the principles of GCP have to be complied with and the entire guideline taken into appropriate account. So there's a statement earlier that guidance does not need to be complied with, it's a recommendation. For GCP, we're in a different scenario. Legislation is legislation, but also compliance with the principles of GCP and taking the rest of the guidance into appropriate account is how it is outlined in Article 47 of the CTR. A bit more than a recommendation. Thank you, Gabrielle. a little bit more, a good bit more. Okay, so let's move to another question around safety, and this is one we got in earlier. Gabriella, it's for you. And the definition of adverse events, potential differences between ICH guidelines, for example, E2A, and which guidelines to adhere to for clinical trials. We were very careful. We couldn't get full alignment, I think, but tell me, what's your view on it, please?
Yeah, if you look now at the final version, we had for the public consultation a slightly different version, I have to say, because at that time we deleted from the definition the administration of IP, and that really caused, let's say, an important difference to ICH E2A. And then after public consultation, we went back to including the administration of IP and therefore replaced this consideration by this occurring medical event before administration in the investigator section, which I presented. Now with the final R3 version, it's very, very close to ICH E2A, only this explanatory addition that this might be signs and symptoms, and that was deleted because it was more explanatory, but the pure definition is aligned. Not word by word, but there is definitely no difference anymore. Substantial difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to pause again, and I'm going to have a plea from the floor. Does anyone please raise your hand if any question? We do see one. Hannah, please.
It's maybe more a general question. First of all, thank you very much for this amazing job. It's really appreciated how the things are more clear to make sure that what we are doing is fit for purpose. I have a question regarding to risk management, which refer to all what we talked yesterday and today. In ICH E6 revision 2, it was the focus on a risk-based approach. In E8 revision 1 says about management of risk to those factors using a risk proportionate approach. In ICH E6 revision 3, we have a proportionate and risk-based approach. I'm just wondering if we could clarify if this word risk proportionate and risk-based is interchangeable, changeably or not. Thank you so much.
can answer it because I really also addressed it yesterday carefully in my presentation, where I talked about the story of the development from revision 2 over E8 to revision 3. And if you look up revision 2, it talks about a risk-based, but it also includes proportionate. I mean, it's a kind of a two-step approach. Again, already existing in revision 3, a little bit differently worded, but more or less the same now in R3, saying, first of all, you need to identify, this critical to quality factors is really something you identify in the design phase. You are looking prospectively to your clinical trial design, to the protocol and protocol-related documents, and are defining, identifying critical to quality factors and try to address them already in getting a better design, which minimize these potential quality risks. This risk-based approach, I mean, it says it starts from the design phase, but it's also continued during the conduct of a clinical trial and also takes into consideration more operational risks, which might not have played the same role in the design phase. Nevertheless, you identify the risk to the critical to quality factors as well as other risks to operational processes which were not considered at that part. And then now you have a number of risks, a high number of risks maybe. And now you need to prioritize your actions to mitigate the risk. And now comes this proportionality in place where you say, okay, what are risks that have a high probability of occurrence and at the same time would cause a high damage to whatever, trial participant safety or to the reliability of results. And then you prioritize your action or the effort, the amount of action you take, you then adapt this, customize this in a proportionate way to the risks and the risk assessment you have made. That's how I understand it. And yesterday we had this example of risk proportionate approach to pre-qualification of service providers. So it might be that during this pre-qualification, you rely on documentation you get because you say, well, it's a standard service and it doesn't cause a high risk to whatever. And then you say, well, I just base my qualification of documentation I received from that service provider. Or you might say, well, if they don't do a good job, I put my participants at risk, or I have a real risk for the data, and you might decide to put more effort by performing, example given, a pre-qualification audit. It's just, now from the spot an invented example to illustrate what this proportionate to the risks, so risk-based or proportionate approach means. I hope this example and explanation helps a bit to clarify the thinking behind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Rosemary?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, so just, I think, following on from the same thing, within our QA, we actually did do a survey in relation to ICH E6 R3, and one of the things that we got feedback on was about the risk-based proportionate approach. And generally, there was a concern that basically it's open to so much interpretation, and generally the feedback that was really more guidance was required. So I know there's training plans to kind of be put in place, but I think if there could be the clinical trial industry, the feeling that we got back within our QA was there needs to be greater understanding on risk thresholds, risk acceptability. And again, if that's kind of defined, hopefully not in an inspection, but actually defined, for example, in some sort of training that's being given, I think that'd be really a brilliant help. And I don't know what the plans are, but it'd be great to know if there is plans to sort of do that and look at different areas in terms of, risk proportionate approach. For example, qualification of investigator sites, looking at their IT systems, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be great to maybe break it up into sort of different areas. But I think that'd be very useful to industry.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And I'd probably maybe put the question to you as well, because we have had criticism in the past of being overly prescriptive, overly burdensome, regulators telling, and this not matching what's on the ground in practice. And I do think industry also has a job to do, and perhaps via RQA, for example, with your members in helping to determine those risk thresholds and learning from your experience. And to put you on the spot, Rebecca, from a sponsor perspective, or Susanna indeed as well. I mean, to me, it's the type of thing, if regulators get so prescriptive, so many training events, then we're becoming too prescriptive and it won't be a flexible guideline accordingly.
Absolutely. And there are two sorts of risk, as Gabriella was talking about, in terms of operational risk. So that's probably something that RQA could have a think about. And also I'd encourage you to look at other associations, because there's other associations that are also got some tools to look at investigator sites. So, you know, maybe sort of look at those tools, work together to get some ideas. But of course, when you talk, I think you mentioned acceptable risk, then you need to be talking to the patients, you know, because it's more on a trial by trial level.
Yeah, risk thresholds. Yeah.
And indeed, we yes, good points. We gave an example of one association, and there are other associations. We're not promoting one or the other here. I've been reminded from the EMA. That's why Kim's here. So the final element, maybe I want to go back to the safety side of things to make sure we're covering all our bases here. There's a question which came in, Gabriella, question number 5 on your sheet regarding the definitions of important protocol deviations and serious non-compliance / serious breach. Is there an alignment between E6, E3, the European Clinical Trial Regulation? Unusual question. I'll hand over to you if you're comfortable on that one. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I volunteer to answer that question because this was exactly an exercise I did during drafting revision 3, and I have prepared 2 slides. Do we have those slides available?
Okay. Yes, good. Very well
You
prepared.
recall?
We need the slides, though.
Maybe we need a minute. Maybe we
Well, hold on. Before we answer it, because we could either take a minute and we can answer another question, or we can get the slides.
Excellent.
It depends, colleagues in the back, how prepared we were for that one.
But I can
No.
also
Maybe
do it
verbalize
verbally.
it, so
I
go
can do it verbally. I also only thought by having it visualized for everybody, it's a bit easier. We tried really to align terms that everybody understands the same by using the terms. And it starts, let's start with protocol deviations. Protocol deviations, and the issue we wanted to tackle is that we very often presented, and it's also a kind of administrative burden, that each and every tiny protocol deviation is captured. And then when we afterwards look into the clinical study report, we have only a very small percentage discussed there. Therefore, we included now in R3 the term important protocol deviations, and even asked sponsors prospectively to define based on that specific clinical trial, but there might be also very general categories, what's considered to be important. And then there might be some more trial-specific expectations, what could happen and would be considered as an important event, also including biostatisticians to predefine important medical events and share that information. With monitors going to investigator sites, but at the same time also, we can now open the first slide. I'm explaining the first slide, was investigators. And if you look here at ICH, okay, that is first, let me now orient myself. That is reflecting what I just explained. The investigator should document, and those deemed important should be explained, and appropriate measures should be implemented to prevent a recurrence. At the same time, to guide investigators about what is important to be followed up, we included in the sponsor section, so section 3, that important protocol deviations, that they are a subset of protocol deviations that may significantly impact the completeness, accuracy, and or reliability of the trial data, and that may significantly affect a participant's right, safety, or well-being, and that the sponsor should determine necessary trial-specific criteria for classifying protocol deviations as important. So the first sentence. That is, again, a mirror of what is the investigator expectation on the investigator, and what is the expectation on the sponsor. Next slide, please. At the same time, if now, sponsor companies, startup companies ask themselves, well, what could be considered as significantly impacting, then please look at ICH E3. There you have a chapter about protocol deviations, and there are also very typical examples provided. It says such as these are examples, but these are the most important ones. Example given, deviations from inclusion-exclusion criteria, again, that have a significant impact. Then participants who developed withdrawal criteria but were not withdrawn would also be an important protocol deviation. Those who received the wrong treatment or incorrect dose, and those who received an excluded concomitant treatment. These are typical examples. Okay, so you see we try to align revision 3 with E3, and also to, let's say, just include a threshold, which then requires reactions, therefore also a proportionate approach. Next slide, please. It's also already my last one. It's now on serious GCP non-compliance, because this was the second part of that questions. And if you compare the definition here of serious GCP non-compliance in Annex 1 in the sponsor section 312, then it says issues that are likely to significantly impact the right, safety, or well-being or reliability of trial results. And we have even put in brackets serious non-compliance, and that came from Europe, to make it clear that this reflects the serious breaches as defined in Article 52 of the CTR. Because if you compare it, then you see it's very close. So what is described in 312.2 reflects Article 52 of the CTR. I hope this really nicely answers the questions that we are very much aligned with European rules and regulations.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you for really diligently taking such time to do that comparison. I think that would be very beneficial for those online and in here, and indeed people can look back at that again. I would say let us go to one final question, and there was one question from the Slido which received quite a high number of thumbs up. Now, it is regarding electronic systems, so I'm going to put Elizabeth on notice. Pay attention. I know it's the end of a long 2 days. Now, this question here is around mitigation measures for non-validated electronic health records, and the printing out of medical records and signing them by the PI. The system is well, it's a mitigation measure, I would say, to meet a level of compliance. With the new framework in R3, is this practice still acceptable? I know that the overarching is we want to move away from mitigation measures, but please tell us.
Yeah, that was sneaky. Thank you for warning me.
I woke you up.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, as inspectors, we would not expect to see that printout of medical records is used as something the monitor should use for monitoring, or that we should use for inspecting. And there are good reasons for that. Those reasons being that many times when we, first of all, we have direct access according to ICH GCP and also sometimes to national legislation. And the reason for that is that we really need to make sure that the information that we have reported to us as source data are really the true source data. which is more frequently that you would believe not the case. So we find discrepant source data, multiple sources of the same data, etc. So we really need the monitors, the auditors, and ourselves to have direct access to make sure that we see not just a summary that somebody made somewhere, but actually the true source data. So it will not be, and it has for many years not been something we would consider appropriate. Having said that, we also realize that some of the reasons why this mitigating action is being used is that the electronic health records are not really fulfilling the requirements that we would usually have to those. One thing that we often hear is that, but our system cannot distinguish between trial participants and non-trial participants, so that would kind of open the electronic records for the monitor to look into. In Denmark, we usually use the example of reviewing the medical record of the Queen or something, just because of interest. And of course, we if the system cannot restrict that use, that doesn't mean that we would not require direct access. We still want to have that. That just means that the system owners will have to make an effort themselves into documenting that nobody took the liberty to go into records where they should not have been. So maybe the IT department can look in the logs of accesses, etc., to ensure that. So we do acknowledge that all medical records cannot fulfill all requirements. So that's also why we talked about earlier today that the sponsors need to really see, are the systems fit for purpose? And if not, what can mitigating actions then be? You would still get a deviation, I would say, for probably a major deviation for not giving direct access. We have sometimes, I would say not accepted, but out of necessity had people sitting there directing us or looking over the shoulder. It's still a deviation because you don't give us direct access. And we will want to push people to make better electronic records, but also this is one of the kind of clinical practice systems, so one of the systems that is not designed specifically for clinical trials, and therefore we also have to acknowledge what it's usually used for, so medical records. So it's not acceptable is the answer. You will get deviations, and then it will be depending on what is it actually used for, the medical record, and we want to push it to get better systems.
Elizabeth, thank you. And I think the overarching message here is what I would say. We understand that electronic health records on the ground in many cases have been designed without clinical trials in mind, actually. E6 does have wording encouraging involvement of investigators during that design. We would all like to get to a situation where we do have systems which are of an appropriate standard for clinical trials, that they have the extra restrictions and so on, which allows for the most efficient access for monitors and inspectors. But we do acknowledge that systems at times are a bit of a patchwork. They're designed without clinical trials in mind. And I think we're trying to move investigators and institutions along to having those better systems. On a global level, we see them outside of the EU at times having very good systems with these aspects in place, and we hope Europe can move to that standard too. Notwithstanding that, I think as chair of the GCP Inspectors Working Group, I do need to ensure we have a consensus around Europe, and this is something that's still actually being very much discussed at an IWG level. So suffice to say, the one thing I would like to preface is that we may have different opinions in different countries. And indeed, these mitigation measures in place are to mitigate, so you can still use a system and run a trial. But I think what Elizabeth's alluding to here around deviations and so on is we do want to encourage moving this in the right direction. And that's the type of pressure that needs to be put on the ground. But I appreciate this could be quite frustrating on the ground. Investigators tend to be using systems that haven't been developed with them in mind. They haven't been involved in that development. We're trying to help moving this into the right direction. Elizabeth, thank you very much for taking that. I very much appreciate it. Now, we're at the end of, I think, a very, very successful day and a half. It's been a great pleasure and privilege for me to be able to chair this event, as I think it's been a fantastic event. We've had, I understand, between 1,400 and 2,000 attendees online at all times. We didn't have a major drop-off, and I understand that's the highest attendance we've had for an ACT-EU event. So really, congratulations and thank you for all of those who've attended online. The overall message here, we've worked hard, all of us have worked hard, the expert working group, but also all of you who've commented and our shared experience in redeveloping the ICH E6 guideline, renovating it and moving it to a guideline that's fit for purpose for the future, is able to respond to new technologies and different trial types, designs and risks. And there's an overarching message here around proportionality, fitness for purpose and risk-based elements, building on what was in R2. We hope it's going to be a guidance which will stand the test of time. And I think really a great success in getting it this far for the finalisation. Of course, patients were at the forefront, and you will see there is a greater focus on patients in the new guidance, and indeed healthcare professionals on the ground running trials as well was a very important element for us to consider. I would like to extend a big thanks to all of the speakers and panelists. You've done a great job. We have got perspectives from across regulators, industry, from healthcare professionals, from patients, patient groups and so on. It was fantastic, and I think that really helped everyone here to understand how this guidance applies to clinical trials and what this really is all about. I would also like to thank some EMA staff who've worked tirelessly in this event and helping to support it. I used to come in from time to time and ask very stupid questions, and used to bear with me in preparing for this event. In particular, I would say the ACT-EU colleagues, Josip Vrikzan, sorry about the pronunciation, Maria-Teresa Caladri and Laura Pioppo, the Program Manager for ACT-EU, all did a lot of work in helping to support. From my own office in inspections, Kim Peach beside me here, Tanya Spatapaulo, Laura Scardoni, Caroline Gombalt and Noemi Balzanella. We've all been working together to get this event over the line on top of very busy workloads, and we've managed to do it. So I would just like to extend a big thank you to colleagues there. But of course, most importantly, to all of you here in the room who travelled here and all of you online who've stuck with it. It's really what's made this event worthwhile. So a big thank you and a big congratulations, and perhaps a round of applause for that, please. A few final reminders. We have a survey for this event. Please fill it in the Slido link. Also, Annex 2 is still in public consultation. Type in EMA open consultations, go to the second page and find Annex 2 and submit your comments, please, if you wish, before the end of the 28th of February. This event has been recorded. It will be placed online. It might take us a few weeks. We will have to do some editing and so on, but it will be online for people to watch back. Also bear in mind there is further training coming out on the ICH website. Go on the ICH website, look at E6, and in around, I suspect around 5 or 6 months' time, we should have some material up there. There's events taking place by the member states, in particular next week. There's an event online from our Danish colleagues, as well as throughout the European network, I suspect, in time and around the world. And yes, really, in relation to questions we received, I think it was up to 200. We tried to answer what we could. We will be creating a summary record where we're going to be outlining some of the key concepts to try and get those messages over the line. I think that's it. Well, then I have the privilege to close this meeting then and wish everyone a safe home. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.